Game of Thrones, The Wrath of the Sleeping Dragon. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 101 Dragon Dream. Viserys heard the voice behind him and turned his head slightly to look behind him. Viserys, why are you here? Viserys saw that the person coming was the priestess, his magic and mystic consultant. I just happened to take her to take a walk in the courtyard, Your Majesty. The slightly fat woman bowed slightly. After following Viserys for so many years, Miri has turned over a new leaf and corrected her past mistakes to become a new person. And her identity has also changed. She used to be an abandoned baby adopted by a temple priest, and she didn't even know who abandoned her parents. But now she can live in a noble castle with her son, receive a good salary, go in and out in a carriage, and her living expenses are even the same as those of the nobles. But she can only persuade herself like this because Viserys' food, clothing and expenses are not extravagant and can even be considered very frugal. Although it is not considered to be the same as the people, it is just the level of an ordinary small noble. Come and meet Your Majesty. Then Miri asked her little son to greet Viserys. Your Majesty. The little boy also greeted the little king, who was a little embarrassed by the smoke and fire. Viserys gently rubbed the boy's hair. Good boy. Then he raised his head and stood up from the ground and looked at Miri Mazdua. Miri, do you have any good ideas? In fact, when the dragon eggs were just sent to the castle, Viserys had summoned everyone to study the method of hatching dragon eggs. However, Miri did not come up with any good methods at that time, but only suggested that they could try to sacrifice a death row prisoner. This method overlapped with the original trajectory in a subtle way, and Viserys also agreed to it. However, in fact, sacrificing a death row prisoner could not hatch dragon eggs. Hatching dragon eggs is not a simple matter. Since the extinction of dragons, Targaryen has paid a huge price and spent a lot of time, but still cannot hatch dragon eggs. And Viserys will naturally not be able to do it so easily, and the current process is in a deadlock. Your Majesty, the blood of the king is only one of the conditions for awakening the dragon, the fat and ugly woman said. Viserys frowned slightly after hearing this. In fact, I have already used my blood. Viserys had already used the old method of dripping blood, but it didn't work. But Viserys understood Miri's meaning in an instant. You mean the usurper? Viserys' frown did not relax. After all, he had even lost the Iron Throne. What kind of king's blood is it except for the title on his head? But I need dragons to kill the usurper and take back the Iron Throne. If I can kill the usurper myself, I'm afraid I won't need dragons at that time, Viserys said. Now the Robert Baratheon dynasty is at its peak, and the damage suffered by the country during the usurper war has been restored. If Viserys now has the strength to lead his army across the narrow sea to kill Robert, then it doesn't matter, even if there are no dragons. No. Miri shook her head slightly after hearing this. Viserys misunderstood her meaning. She did not deny that Viserys has the blood of the king flowing in his body. Your Majesty, you were crowned by the 7 gods, and it is indisputable that you have the blood of a real dragon flowing in your body. But these alone are not enough to hatch a dragon. Viserys nodded slightly when he heard the woman's words. This was indeed the case. That's right. In the history of the Targaryen family, there were many strange methods after the extinction of the dragons, such as praying to the dragon eggs day and night, and even drinking wildfire to turn themselves into dragons, but none of them worked. What else is needed? The little king stood by the campfire, the flames still constantly roasting the black dragon eggs, and asked in confusion. Magic? Miri spoke in a firm tone. The extinction of dragons was not just because the growth environment was restricted. A scholar in the Citadel once believed that the extinction of the last Targaryen dragon was because the space in the dragon cave was too narrow, which made it impossible for the dragon to grow. However, in fact, the last Targaryen dragon died early and had not yet reached the growth space restricted by the dragon cave. Mortals need to eat food, breathe air, and drink water on land to survive. As an Azalin, Miri's customs are somewhat similar to those of the Dothraki. They also believe that sea water is poisonous, and dragons need the blood of real dragons to awaken. They need to devour cattle and sheep to grow, and they need huge magical power to maintain their lives. The blood of real dragons in your body contains magical power, which can awaken dragons. This is just a prerequisite, but it is not enough. And Viserys understood Mirror's words this time. You mean, now magic has not returned, there is no growth environment needed by dragons, so it is difficult to hatch them. But this time Mirror's face became a little serious, and her round, fat, ugly face was full of solemnity. No, that's not all I want to say, Your Majesty. I have noticed that perhaps the Blue Lips, Shadowbinders, witches, priests of the Moon Senior Temple, and Dr. Marwyn of the Academy in the East have all noticed that the power of magic seems to be returning and is getting closer and closer. What? Viserys was slightly shocked by the priestess's sudden words and felt a chill all over his body. Then the bonfire next to him suddenly burst out with sparks. Puff, the flames flowed in the air and spewed out black smoke. And the black dragon egg wrapped in flames, I don't know if it was Viserys' illusion, seemed to be faintly outlined with a layer of light gold. A black mist gradually spread from Viserys' side. Then a wisp of black mist merged into a stream that wrapped the entire dragon egg and penetrated into it along the imperceptible gap on the eggshell. Viserys Targaryen strength, Sun. 12 Constitution, Earth. 10 Agility, Water. 13 Spirit, Moon. 22 Viserys saw the black mist condensed into words in High Valyrian from the flames, completely exposing his current attribute list. However, the next second, the scene in front of him changed again, and the world around him turned into darkness. Only a giant dragon covered with scales, and with lava flowing and the gaps lingered in the thick black mist. A pair of huge scarlet eyes penetrated the darkness, and looked down at him. Chapter 102 Golden Pattern. Dragon Dream. Viserys was in the darkness, standing in front of this behemoth, as small as a grain of dust. However, even if he could firmly believe that what he was facing now was just the dragon dream that his ancestors had encountered many times, he still felt a strong fear coming when he really stood in front of it. This creature beyond the scope of conventional cognition was enough to tear apart the worldview that Viserys had always maintained. This is too big. The silver-haired boy stood in front of this behemoth whose body was comparable to the mountains and rivers, and felt that even his breathing had stagnated. This terrifying dragon was covered with dark and thick scales all over its body. Lava flowed in the gaps between each scale, emitting strong light and heat, and then dripped into this dark world. How the heavy breathing sounded like thunder, and the black mist wrapped the entire dragon in it, making it difficult to see its huge size. But the silver-haired boy was not even as big as a scale in front of him. Although Viserys had never seen the appearance of Valyrian, the Black Death, he felt that this dragon should be much larger than the 150-meter Black Death. The dragon lingering in the black mist looked down at the little devil standing in front of him, as if looking at an ant, raising its hideous and handsome head high, and stretching its slender neck gracefully. Then, without even a roar, the dragon opened its deep and huge mouth, and the terrifying red dragon flame surged out, instantly wrapping Viserys completely in it. In an instant, the handsome skin of the silver-haired boy turned into ashes, the blood in his body was evaporated by the flames, and his body and hair all disappeared, as if evaporating out of thin air, and disappeared in this dream world. In the outside world, Viserys stared at the bonfire in front of him with a dazed look. Miri was still talking about her theory, and then he found that the little king was not listening at all, and seemed to be a little distracted. Your Majesty? The priestess was a little strange. Viserys had never been distracted while talking before, and following Viserys' gaze, she saw a ball of fire. Your Majesty? Miri felt that something was wrong with Viserys' state, and then waved her hand in front of him again. Then she saw Viserys suddenly shudder, his whole body trembling, as if he had a serious illness. Cold sweat on his forehead instantly flowed down, his chest heaved, one hand supported the side, and he gasped heavily. Your Majesty. Miri saw that Viserys' face was as pale as paper, and cold sweat on his forehead flowed down like it was free of money. She was a little panicked for a moment, and then took out the medicine bottle she carried with her from her sleeve. The priestess had learned the knowledge of herbs from a Dothraki woman, and the magician Dr. Marwyn of the academy had also taught her, so she also had certain medical skills. However, Viserys seemed to have recovered a little at this time and waved his hand to stop the woman from treating him. I'm fine. He just had a dragon dream, and in the dragon dream he once again encountered a giant dragon. This was not the first time Viserys had encountered it. The last time he fainted after the coronation, Viserys felt that he had had countless dreams, dreaming of the doomsday scourge of Illyria, dreaming of a black dragon breathing fire at him, but this time he dreamed of the same scene again. Why? What happened? Viserys was puzzled. He didn't understand why he always had such dragon dreams, and what exactly did their appearance again and again indicate. However, Viserys felt that it didn't seem to have any malice. It seemed to be singing to him, and although the dragon flames it spewed completely devoured him, it seemed to be cleansing him and training him. After a sweat fell, Viserys felt that his whole body became much lighter, and even his breathing became smoother, as if he had been reborn. At this time, Mira's son, Little Hut, seemed to have discovered something, and then pulled his mother's hand. Mom, look, the flames are out. A breeze blew by. The extinguished bonfire left only black floating ashes and broken dregs, and the dragon egg still lay quietly on the grill. Viserys was slightly stunned. He and Miri had not noticed how the bonfire went out just now. The fire with a lot of firewood could have burned for a long time. However, before he could think about it, Viserys' eyes were attracted by the dragon egg lying quietly on the grill. The black dragon egg was still as deep as the dark depths of the sea, but in this darkness without a trace of light, a strange golden pattern appeared, as if it had grown on this dragon egg, and it reflected a brilliant light slightly in the sun. But Viserys was sure that there was no golden pattern on the dragon egg not long ago, and there was a tiny crack under this golden pattern, which seemed to be the place where the black fog had just entered. Your Majesty, you might as well be more patient. The priestess standing next to the little king looked at Viserys holding his dragon egg in a daze, and then began to advise. The wind of revival has blown, and the dragon sleeping in the stone will eventually wake up. If you rush or force hatching, it may be counterproductive. There are too many tragedies caused by forced hatching of dragon eggs in the history of the Targaryen family. Viserys was slightly absent-minded while holding his black dragon egg, which was still as hard as iron, and then nodded. At this time, Your Majesty, Mr. Gunnar was still wearing the simple grey bachelor's robe, holding a letter in his hand and walking hurriedly. He saw Viserys holding his dragon egg in a daze. He didn't know the cause and effect, and he was a little worried that the little king had lost his mind because he wanted to hatch the dragon egg. At the same time, he looked at the priestess standing next to Viserys warily. The other party claimed that he had learned knowledge from Dr. Marwyn, and Mr. Gunnar's own teacher had a good relationship with Dr. Marwyn. He once wrote a letter to ask the teacher for confirmation, but the teacher replied to tell him that Dr. Marwyn had been traveling around the world for a long time and had not returned to the city. When he returned, he would personally verify the identity of this woman. Something big has happened. Mr. Gunnar glanced at the other party, then whispered into Viserys' ear. Viserys was awakened by the Maester's voice. Something big? Viserys was slightly stunned, and then Mr. Gunnar whispered a few more words into Viserys' ear. The expression on the little king's face changed clearly, and then he nodded. Go to the meeting room. Chapter 103 Red Robe Woman. Flutter, a group of crows that had been resting on the top of the castle tower for a long time suddenly flapped their wings and flew into the sky. And Viserys also left the courtyard with the Maester and went to the meeting hall. At the same time, in the distance, in a magnificent temple, monks in red robes were walking around the temple. After meeting each other, they put their hands together and bowed slightly, then left in a hurry without saying a word. A woman in red was kneeling on a mat, and in front of her was a brazier with flames burning in the brazier. The woman in red knelt quietly in her place and stared at the fire in front of her. At this time, the flame in the brazier suddenly jumped slightly, disrupting the previous burning rhythm. The red-robed woman's heart also skipped a beat, and she suddenly woke up from the state of visualization just now. What's going on? The woman's eyes condensed slightly, and her gaze fell on the jumping and twisted flames. Then, she seemed to see pictures from this flame. This is. The surprised expression on the woman's face gradually became calm, and her beautiful eyes did not even blink. She even became a little fascinated by the scene and the flames. It turns out that the dragon is about to be resurrected. The enchanting woman in red robes just saw the figure of a silver-haired boy in the flames. He seemed to be roasting a huge egg, and then talking to a woman. Then a bachelor in a grey robe with a chain around his neck came over, and the two talked for a few more words. However, all the pictures she saw were just silent short films, without any sound, and finally stopped abruptly. No wonder his power is reviving. After the picture stopped, the woman was silent for a while, and then whispered softly. Not only her, but also the other red-robed monks in the temple could feel that their connection with the Lord of Light was becoming closer. Even small-scale fire magic with a very low success rate could be performed. Coupled with the magic that was most proficient, there were many more believers in front of the Red Temple recently than usual. And all this is a miracle that has never been repeated since the extinction of the dragon. The followers of the Lord of Light are different from other forms of magic believers. They do not recognize the existence of magic tides, and these people put forward a contradictory argument. They believe that it is dragons that bring magic, not magic that brings dragons. Because they find that when dragons exist, their connection with the Lord of Light will deepen, and after the extinction of dragons, all monks can no longer feel the traces of the god of shadow and fire. Therefore, these followers of the Lord of Light devoutly believe that dragons and gods must have some kind of connection. Then, a breeze blew, and the flames in the brazier completely dissipated. The woman's copper-red hair fluttered in the wind, revealing half of her delicate cheeks. She opened her red lips, and muttered to herself. It seems that the great Lord of Light has given me guidance. Then the beautiful woman stood up from the kneeling cushion, and the loose red robe was slightly restrained, covering the whiteness of her chest. It seemed that there was a boiling heat in her body, which always attracted people's eyes to fall on her involuntarily. I need to go. Then the woman looked into the distance. In the distance, in the meeting hall of Andarisburg, there was a rebellion in the Iron Islands. Did Baron Greyjoy declare himself king? Viserys sat on a chair in the meeting hall, looked at the intelligence in his hand, and then raised his head. This was the big event that the Maester was talking about. The rebellion in the Iron Islands was like a heavy bomb that set off a storm in Westeros. After all, no one could have imagined that the Iron Islands would suddenly launch a rebellion without making any noise, and even caught the Lannisters off guard, and also disrupted Viserys' plan. Viserys vaguely remembered that there was indeed a rebellion in the Iron Islands. Theon, who later lost his brother, became the adopted son of Eddard Stark, the Duke of Winterfell. However, he didn't remember the specific year when this happened. He didn't expect it to happen at this time. It seems that the burning of the 7 sacred septs was not without purpose. The Greyjoy family had planned it long ago. So, what should we do? Viserys raised his head and looked at the people in the meeting hall, including his Prime Minister Sir Geoffrey, Prince Oberyn from Dorne, the head coach Sir William Derry, who also came with a cane, and the Maesters from Dragonstone. Your Majesty, I think we should take the opportunity to attack King's Landing, kill the usurper, and take back the Iron Throne. When the head coach heard Viserys' words, he was a little excited and stood up impatiently and spoke. His health was already very poor, and he didn't know how many more years he could live. If he hadn't rested in Andalus, he might have passed away long ago. However, his greatest wish to avenge his brother Jon Darry and help the Targaryens take back the Iron Throne had not yet been realized. Now they have taken root in the Andal people's homeland and started to accumulate strength. The sudden change in Westeros has once again caused a wave of turmoil. He thinks that this is a good time to send troops to attack Westeros. After all, there are still many nobles loyal to Targaryen in the 7 kingdoms. If His Majesty leads his troops back to Westeros and then raises his arms. However, when the grey-haired old man finished speaking, everyone present was silent. Although a certain amount of strength has been accumulated now, is it too early to attack Westeros at this time? Ahem. At this time, the old knight coughed lightly and spoke. He first glanced at Sir William, the former coach of the Red Castle, who was 20 years younger than him. However, now one eye is half blind, his legs and feet are not flexible, and he needs to walk with a cane. His grey hair looks older than his age, and then he continued. If we form an alliance with the Iron Islands, plus Dorne, can the 3 of us attack Westeros? The viewpoint raised by the old knight made everyone present look at each other in bewilderment. The silver-haired young man sitting in the center was still wearing plain casual clothes, with one hand on his chin, his lavender eyes fixed on the table, and it was unknown what he was thinking about. Viserys did not speak, and everyone's eyes fell on Oberyn, the Prince of Dawn. Oberyn rubbed his soft beard slightly, and did not speak in a hurry. He was silent for a while and then spoke. Now is not the best time to attack Westeros. The strength of the wolf, deer, and osprey alliance is still very strong, and now there are lions. Lannister now has a queen in the Red Castle. But even if the time is not yet ripe, it does not mean that we cannot participate in this war. Chapter 104, Battle of Heijiang City. Everyone present understood what Oberyn said. Andalus does not have enough power to challenge the powerful alliance of wolves, deer, and ospreys. When Targaryen was still sitting on the Iron Throne, he lost the war with the support of a large number of nobles, let alone now. The coalition of the North, Stormlands, Riverlands and Vale overthrew the rule of Targaryen. Now Robert Baratheon is sitting on the Iron Throne and his strength is only stronger than 6 years ago. And Targaryen is far worse than at the beginning of the war. Therefore, everyone knows all these truths. Now at most, they just take advantage of the rebellion of the Iron Islands to cause some trouble to the usurper, so that he will not be able to complete the rebellion so smoothly. Then, everyone's eyes were focused on Viserys. After everyone's opinions were expressed, Viserys needed to make the final conclusion on this matter. Unlike the situation where the little king was trembling with fear and treading on thin ice before, he now actually holds most of the power in his hands. Bring me a map. After some thought, Viserys asked a guard to bring the map and spread it on the table. Then his eyes fell on the direction of the Iron Islands and Lannisport. This was the first battle after the rebellion of the Iron Islands. Then his eyes fell on seaward in the Riverlands. Although the Westerlands are rich, most of them are fortified cities, and the mountains are undulating, and the terrain is complex, which is not suitable for the Ironborn to plunder. And seaward in the Ironborn Bay has been a castle and town built to resist the Ironborn since ancient times. Behind seaward is the fertile and flat Riverlands. Just like the former king of the Iron Islands, Harwin, the Iron Hand of the whole family, took the land of the Riverlands from Alec Durandon, the then Storm King. What he relied on was to bypass seaward, land 40 miles south of seaward, and then lead the Ironborn to carry longboats on their shoulders, walk to the Blue Fork River, and then take a boat to start plundering along the river. Therefore, if the Iron Islands want to quickly open up the situation in this war and restore the former territory of the Iron Kingdom, they must first conquer seaward. As long as seaward can be conquered, everything will go much more smoothly. The next goal of the Iron races should be here. As long as seaward is conquered, the Iron Islands will still have room to maneuver in this war. At that time, we will have the opportunity to directly intervene in this war. Viserys bit his finger and thought deeply, and then the finger of his other hand fell on the location of seaward on the map. Prince Oberyn, who was leaning on the chair, looked at Viserys with some surprise. He didn't expect Viserys to think the same as him. Forget it. In the end, Viserys thought deeply and gave up the impulse to rush into Westeros to challenge the Iron Throne now. This is a war that is bound to fail. There is no need for us to get too involved. Everyone in the conference hall nodded slightly, except for Sir William. No one thought that Greyjoy's rebellion would succeed. The soil of the Iron Islands is barren and mostly rocky, and the Ironmen have no cattle or horses to farm. The only mineral resource on the island is cheap iron ore, and the resources are not as abundant as those in the Westerlands, so the Ironmen have relied on plundering since ancient times. Therefore, in such a place, without sufficient resources and supplies, and without enough soldiers to consume, how can it beat the Iron Throne, which has a far greater advantage in material supplies and the number of soldiers? Although this is indeed a good opportunity, the involvement of the Targaryen fleet can cause a lot of trouble to the usurper, but that's all. It's not enough to shake Robert's rule. At the same time, Viserys doesn't want to overstimulate this king, lest the other party goes crazy and leads his knights to swim across the narrow sea to beat him. After all, for now, he still has to focus on development and accumulate his strength in a low-key manner. Although the possibility is not great, it is best to make Robert Baratheon feel that he has settled down and is happy. According to the intelligence collected by the Mr. Viserys learned that Prince Joffrey in the Red Castle had passed his third name day, and Queen Cersei Lannister is now pregnant again, and her second child may be born next year. Such a big thunder has long been buried under the buttocks of the Iron Throne. Viserys only needs to wait quietly for the thunder to explode and watch the Baratheon dynasty fall apart. So he is not in a hurry to get involved in the rebellion in the Iron Islands, so as not to lose troops and overly stimulate King Robert, causing the other party to feel threatened and then work hard to govern. However, the rebellion in the Iron Islands is just right. King Balon directly took away King Robert's hatred, and Viserys had a lot more breathing space. Then, next we will seize the opportunity created by Balon Greyjoy for us. Viserys' eyes were fixed on the map around Indorus, and then his fingers swiped to the mountains east of the Upper Rhoyne River and an ancient road leading to the Bay of Loras. This is the ancient settlement of the Rhoyne. The sudden outbreak of the rebellion war in the Iron Islands was beyond everyone's expectations. However, the Iron Throne responded quickly when the knights began to gather quickly at the king's call. However, before they finished gathering, the attack of the Iron Islands came like a rainstorm and a strong wind. This set of combined punches directly made the head of the shrewd Duke of Casterly rock buzz. He had never expected that this neighbor on the sea would be so unethical. The fire in Lannisport had not completely dissipated, and then countless small longboats driven by the Ironmen came from the sea. They landed from various coasts and began to burn, kill and plunder indiscriminately in the west. For a time, the land of the west was full of gunpowder. On the other side, because of this victory in Lannisport, there was no other maritime force on the Sea of the Iron Bay. The Iron Fleet can freely attack the strategic city of Seamagin. It is the only port in the Riverlands leading to the Sunset Sea. It is the only way for the Ironmen to enter the rich Riverlands to burn, kill and plunder. And King Balon really sent troops to attack Seamagin, just as many people including Viserys expected, and Seamagin was well prepared this time. The bronze bell on the top of the city rang for the first time in 300 years. Roderick Greyjoy, the eldest son of King Balon of the Iron Islands, led the Ironmen to attack Seamagin, and Lord Jason Mallister, who was well prepared in Seamagin, personally led his troops to resist tenaciously. Fierce fighting broke out between the two sides under the city wall. In the end, the brave Lord Jason killed Roderick Greyjoy, the Prince of the Iron Islands. In the melee, the Ironmen were in chaos and fled back to the sea in a hurry. Chapter 105, Rhoyne. The Battle of Sea Marsh came to an end. After the Iron Islands rebellion had a good start, it suffered a heavy blow. Not only did it lose soldiers and generals, but King Balon Greyjoy, who proclaimed himself king, also lost a son. After the first blow, the morale of the Iron Throne was slightly low, and the Battle of Sea Marsh undoubtedly boosted morale. Then, with the absolute advantage in the number of soldiers and supplies, they began to organize a counterattack. The army soon began to gather. Beep, the horn sounded. The knights in the Reach, who were ready to go, boarded the warships and sailed to Fair Island. They had to assemble here first, and then fight a decisive battle with the chaotic army of the Iron Islands. The royal fleet led by Stannis himself was also bypassing the Broken Arm of Dawn, crossing the Summer Sea, and rushing to Fair Island to join the coalition. Lord Eddard Stark of the North also responded to the king's call. He personally led the cavalry of the North to the south, and was crossing the neck, waiting for the royal warship to arrive, and then board the warship, and kill to Pike Island, to take the head of Balon Greyjoy. King Robert, who was furious a few days ago, and was ready to lead the expedition in person, was finally persuaded by the Prime Minister Jon Arryn to stay in King's Landing. However, he was itching to do something these days and got angry. In the end, the old man reluctantly agreed to the king's wish to go to the battle in person, but there was only one requirement, that is, Robert could only command in the rear, and could not go to the battlefield in person. In order to leave King's Landing smoothly, Robert naturally patted his chest and promised his adoptive father that he would never go to the battle in person, but just stay in the rear honestly. Of course, it is unknown how credible his words are. In the west of Westeros, the Sunset Sea was in chaos, and everyone's eyes were on this chaotic battlefield. On the continent east of the Narrow Sea, Andalus also began to act. Viserys was wearing his polished silver armor, a long sword at his waist, a black cape with a fiery red background behind him, and riding on his snow-white warhorse. Because he was not wearing a helmet, the young knight's slightly curly silver gold hair was scattered and hung on the cold armor, and the hair fluttered slightly in the wind. Go. The young king clamped his legs on the horse's belly, and the warhorse was urged forward. Then he pulled his reins with one hand, turned the horse's head, and looked at the soldiers surrounding him. On the other side, Prince Oberyn was also ready. He followed the young king to the battle this time. Oberyn was wearing a black armor, and the brilliant golden spear emblem on his chest was the emblem of the Martell family. Oberyn sat on the horse's back and held the hilt with one hand. Tap, tap, tap. The white horse was restlessly rubbing its hooves. The silver-armored knight rode a white horse and ran a circle in front of the battle formation, with his buttocks firmly connected to the saddle. This integration of riding and war horses can greatly save his physical strength. Let's go, then. Accompanied by an order. Rumble. Andalis's army broke camp and set up camp. Looking down from the sky, you can see that the army gradually began to crawl on the ground and headed east of the Upper Rhine River. As a city with only Andals, Andalis's ceiling of development potential has long been limited. And Viserys' long list of titles includes Andals, Rhoynar and King of the First Men, so he has long been eyeing the Rhoynar settlements living east of the Upper Rhoynar River. Then finally, when the war broke out on the other side of the Narrow Sea and the suzerain of Bravos also focused on Westeros, Viserys chose to take the initiative to attack and recapture these Rhoynar settlements. An autumn rain, continuous and endless. Trample, tample. The horses' hooves galloped on the muddy ground, and the knights sitting on the war horses shouted and fought fiercely. Holding the blood-stained spear, he directly picked up a corpse and flew it into the air. Bang, then it fell heavily on the ground. Defeat them. Viserys' snow-white warhorse's mane had turned blood red at this moment. He held the reins with one hand, breathing a little heavy, and held the spear with the other hand. The sharp tip of the spear was still dripping with blood. The Andals and the Rhoynar had a deep hatred in history, and it completely broke out at this time. Kill. The shouts of killing from both sides shook the sky. A large number of Andal warriors poured into the gate of the town that had been breached. Both tribes had a glorious history, but later they declined collectively, and their strength was close. However, now the Andals have been unified, just like the leader Cologne who once unified the Andal plains. The unified Andals have exerted greater strength. The Andal warriors were better equipped and better trained, so the Andalus soldiers crushed the resistance organized by the Rhoynar with ease. Then they completely broke through this small town of the Rhoynar. The Andals, the Rhoynar, and the King of the First Men are here. Surrender and you will be spared death. The air in the town was full of the smell of burning, and the sight was full of burning flames. Many figures shuttled through it, with chaotic footsteps, shouts, and then the sound of shouting and killing. Viserys' long list of titles sometimes not only sounds cool on the surface, but also has a certain meaning. At least it gave those Rhoynar who wanted to surrender, but couldn't find a reason to surrender, an excuse to kneel down. I surrender. Clang clang clang. With one person laying down his weapons and kneeling down to surrender, everything became much smoother, and a large number of Rhoynar who resisted laid down their weapons. Your Majesty. Although the majority of people surrendered, there were still some who still resisted in the face of the general trend. Viserys rode into the town on a warhorse, holding the reins with one hand, and his bright blood-stained armor attracted the attention of the enemy. Kill him. The Rhoynar soldiers hiding behind the burning earth wall raised their bows and arrows to shoot Viserys, but the guards around the little king raised their shields in time to block all the arrows. Bang bang bang. Seeing this scene, Viserys' last thought of persuading the surrender disappeared. Humph. Then Viserys turned over and dismounted, put on his shield, and personally took up his sword, and led several soldiers to kill these stubborn people. Although he was not old, due to fate, Viserys had been battle-hardened, and had witnessed and participated in many wars. I don't know whether to say this is lucky or unfortunate. Less than half a day passed. Andalis's army conquered this Rhoynar town. Chapter 106 Assassination. About 1,000 years ago, the ancient Rhoynar city-state and the Valyrian freehold went to war. It took about 250 years from the first conflict to the complete defeat. Maester Gunda held a book and talked to Viserys while walking. In fact, in theory, the Maester is a servant serving Westeros. The young Maester was sent by the Citadel because of Dragonstone. If Dragonston changes hands, he will serve the next lord. However, there are always accidents. There are Meesters who follow the nobles to leave their fiefdoms in history. There are even many, such as the Meester of Storm's End who followed Stannis. This is actually decided by the Meesters themselves. They are Meesters of the Citadel in name, but in fact they have become retainers of the nobles. Sometimes it is just an ideal state for the Meesters not to be linked to politics. And in the east of the Upper Rhine River, the small town called Valor was just conquered by the Andalus army. The Second Spice War reached its peak. Prince Gerrin of the Rhoynar led 250,000 Rhoynar to resist tenaciously and repelled the Valyrian invaders. 2 dragons died, and a dragon king fled in panic. However, more powerful dragons flew from the freehold. They were different from the 3 dragons that had been defeated. The Meester paused slightly at this point, looked at the records in the book, and was silent for a while before continuing. They were several times larger than the previous dragons, and there were as many as 300 dragons. Prince Gerrin's 250,000 Rhoynar army was reduced to ashes. Prince Gerrin was imprisoned in a golden cage and hung on the city wall to witness the destruction of his city-state and the enslavement of his people. But the rest is a legend. Your Majesty, you can listen to these stories or not. The Meester glanced at the records at the end and then spoke. The 2 walked and talked, and Viserys nodded slightly. Then the Meester continued. Legend has it that before his death, Prince Gerrin cursed the Valyrians with tears and blood, calling on the Mother River to avenge her people. That night, the Rhine River suddenly surged with a force rarely seen in history. A thick evil fog forever enveloped Chern, and countless Valyrian invaders who could not rest in peace received Gerrin's curse, that is, grayscale, and died there. And this story says that Prince Gerrin finally climbed out of his underwater grave and ruled this sad territory forever in the name of the Shroud King. This period of history is very long, covering the glory and destruction of the Rhoyne city-state 1,000 years ago. Viserys knows the story behind it, and Oberyn knows it too. His ancestors had the blood of the ancient Rhoyne. The legendary female warrior Nymeria of the Rhoyne led the ancient Rhoyne across the narrow sea to Dawn, and married Oberyn's ancestor, Mors Martell. Although the ancient city-state has long been reduced to ashes, there are still many Rhoyne villages and towns on both sides of the Rhoyne River, which is the mother river for the Rhoyne people. Viserys' purpose of sending troops this time was to bring these villages and towns under his command. Now, after a series of conquests in the early stage, the Rhoynar people near the source of the Mother River, the Upper Rhoynar, have organized a rebellion, and were defeated by Viserys' army here. Your Majesty, as the King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, you should never rely on one race. In fact, you should have made such a decision a long time ago, the Meester said. He actually agreed with Viserys' idea. Don't be obsessed with the Iron Throne and fall into the curse, but develop yourself in the Essos continent with great potential. If Viserys insisted on participating in the rebellion in the Iron Islands, it is very likely that he would not only gain nothing, but also lose troops and generals, and slow down his own development. Well, that makes sense. Viserys nodded. The 2 people stepped on the muddy land. The traces of the fight last night had not been completely cleaned up. The broken and charred houses could still be seen in the town, and there were still bloodstains on the walls. Then the 2 of them came to the gate of a relatively intact courtyard, which was Viserys' temporary residence. The Andals on the Andal Plains, and the Rhoynar on both sides of the Upper Rhoynar River were in a similar situation. Now both races have lost their former glory. This large triangular area sandwiched between the 3 city-states of Norvus, Bravus and Pentus is actually a power vacuum. The system of the free trade city-states determines that it does not have the strong territorial desire of the imperial system. Viserys seized this opportunity to gradually develop himself in this area where there was no foothold. So, what should we do next? Viserys and the Meester stopped outside the gate of the courtyard and talked. The people coming and going around were mostly captured captives. One of the captured Rhoynar slaves seemed to have heard the conversation between Viserys and the Meester, raised his head slightly, and his eyes flashed, but it was not known whether he could understand the common language of Westeros. Although the common language was brought to Westeros by the Andals and the Rhoynar, it has changed after such a long time of evolution and even sounds like 2 different languages. Die. Then the slave suddenly pounced on Viserys when he passed by him, making a hoarse roar and trying to strangle Viserys' neck with the iron chain that bound his hands. What? The attack happened unexpectedly, but his sudden action was seen by the little king out of the corner of his eye, and then he quickly dodged. Snap! Viserys reacted in time, dodging the slave's attack, and at the same time tightly grasped the other's wrist with one hand. With his other hand, he pulled out the dagger from the waist of the guard beside him, and directly placed it on the neck of the Roina slave, and then lightly cut the other's throat. Puff! Blood sprayed out, and the Roina slave was full of disbelief, covering his throat with his chained hands, and then his body fell to the ground. He originally wanted to hold Viserys hostage and escape, but he didn't expect the other party to react so quickly. Your Majesty. The guards around Viserys hadn't even reacted yet. When the slave was dead, the guards were shocked and angry. The other Roina slaves who passed by knelt down in fear. They were not accomplices of this man. They were afraid that the little king would implicate them. The Maester witnessed the whole scene. He watched Viserys take a deep breath, then took a handkerchief from the guards to wipe the blood off his hands. Your Majesty, are you okay? I'm fine. Viserys shook his head gently, then glanced at the body lying on the ground, with the gloom in his eyes. He had encountered too many assassinations of this level, and had even become numb. Chapter 107. Half a year. Then, does your Majesty have an answer to the question just now? The Maester was silent for a moment, watching the bodies of the captives who attacked Viserys being dragged away by the guards, and then raised his head. Viserys was speechless for a moment, then nodded. He understood what the Maester meant. The steps of a war of conquest are actually very similar. First using force, and then the carrot and stick policy. The two banks of the upper Rhine River radiating from Andalus is actually the territory that Viserys is exploring. The land in this place is flat and fertile, suitable for growing crops, but unfortunately there are no mineral resources, so it can only be the most primitive agricultural economy. Moreover, this place has a mixed ethnic group, with Andals and Roina people, and Dothraki people occasionally come here to graze, burn, kill and loot. It is for these reasons that the 3 free trade cities surrounding this place did not take action here. Because for merchants and governors, the benefits that can be obtained here are not great, and it is likely to arouse the vigilance of other free trade cities. I understand. Time passed quickly. Year 290 of the Egan calendar. Since the rebellion broke out in the Iron Islands across the Narrow Sea, Balon Greyjoy was crowned king. He first burned Lannisport, and then suffered a setback in Seamarsh, which killed his heir Roderick. Then the Iron Throne assembled a large number of troops, and the newly invested royal fleet also participated in the war. In the Battle of Fairy Island, the royal fleet led by Stannis Baratheon collided head-on with the Iron Fleet, which was once invincible on the Sunset Sea. A fierce naval battle broke out between the two sides. In the end, Stannis defeated the famous Iron Fleet by setting an ambush, making Balon Greyjoy's third brother Victarion taste the taste of failure for the first time. Balon's youngest brother Aeron Greyjoy also fell into the sea in this naval battle, and was then captured and imprisoned in Casterly Rock until the end of this rebellion. The Iron Fleet was defeated, and the situation for the Iron Islands was already precarious. Later, Stannis, as the Lord Admiral, conquered Great Wyke in the name of his brother, while the captain of the King's Guard, Ser Barristan the Fearless, led the army to capture Old Wyke. In the final battle, King Robert and Lord Eddard Stark personally commanded the battle, and Portly Castle and Kingsport on Pike Island had been destroyed by war. The catapults bombarded Pike City continuously, and finally shattered the main watchtower and part of the southern wall. Balon's second son, Meryn Greyjoy, also died when the city was broken. Thoros, a red monk who believed in the Lord of Light, once again reignited the Sword of Fire, and took the lead in rushing into the city, followed by Jorah Mormont. Then the royal army occupied Pike City, and the crowned King Balon Greyjoy took off the crown again after only wearing it for less than a year, and knelt down to surrender to King Robert. His only son, Theon Greyjoy, who was only 9 years old, was also taken hostage by Lord Eddard Stark as his adopted son. The rebellion in the Iron Islands finally came to an end. While the fighting in Westeros was going on, Andalus, far away in Essos, was also not idle. This was the most precious opportunity for development. While the Iron Throne had no time to pay attention to the situation here, he decisively sent troops to seize the opportunity to sweep across the Roina settlements on both sides of the upper Roine River. Viserys personally led his troops to the battle, and the farthest eastward he went was directly to Norvus, and he came to the Norn River, even alarming the monks of Norvus. The bearded monks in the temple did not seem to expect that the Andalus people would suddenly appear here. They were all surprised and doubtful, holding axes and confronting the Andalus army for several days, and then both sides retreated and did not interfere with each other. When Andalus expanded westward, he walked as far as the Velvet Mountains along the upper Roine River. The ancient Valyrian road from Pentus to Norvus and then to Koha was touched. The caravans along the way were terrified and thought they were going to encounter an accident, but Andalus's army did not harm them at all and then retreated on their own initiative. Your Majesty, this was once a city of the Roina, a beautiful place, a city made up of green land and flowers, canals, and fountains. Viserys still rode his white warhorse. Following him on horseback was a Roina guide named Devon, who had olive skin and messy black hair. He was one of the first Roina to kneel and surrender. He witnessed the assassination half a year ago with his own eyes. At that time, Evan thought he was dead, but he never expected that the king would not implicate everyone but let them go. And Evan was driven to charge in the subsequent battles as a prisoner of war, and was finally canonized as a knight by Viserys himself. Such honors are rare. Viserys has only conferred titles on a few people so far, one of whom is his personal guard, Knight Bessie. Therefore, Evan has always been grateful to Viserys. Really? Viserys sat on the horseback and turned his head slightly to look at the surrounding environment when he heard Evan's words beside him. The sound of horse hooves likely stepping on the stone road made a sound, and the soldiers around were constantly shuttling. However, the places around Viserys were already full of ruins and walls, with a strong historical color, but there was no trace of the past. It has been more than half a year since the troops began to expand the territory, and Andalus has almost restored the territory of the ancient Andalus kingdom. Except for the area south of the Velvet Mountains, the flat land now controlled by the Pentus people, which was once the southern border of the ancient Andalus kingdom, and has not yet been captured. Now Viserys led Andalus to explore these unowned lands. Not only the Andals who once migrated to Andalus, but also the Andal villages that did not migrate back then were completely swallowed up by Viserys, including a large number of Roina villages. This way. Hurry up. Don't fall behind. The soldiers who were on the expedition were now walking through this ancient abandoned Roina city-state, checking everything in the city. Now, Targaryen soldiers are no longer just Andals. A large number of Roina were recovered in the expansion war in the past 6 months. Many of these Roina joined the Targaryen banner. Now, after 6 months of fighting outside, the number of people has not decreased, but has snowballed. At this time, a horse ran over from a distance. A Roina warrior sat on the horse, with mottled blood on his body, as if several arrows were inserted. Then his body shook and he fell off the horse. Chapter 108, The Dothraki. HMM. What happened? Viserys' heart tightened slightly when he saw this scene. Then he turned over and dismounted and walked quickly to the soldier who was shot by the arrow. And Sir Avan beside him also dismounted and followed, and then called the doctor who accompanied the army. Where are the people? Come quickly. Not long after, a doctor who was proficient in herbs hurriedly ran over with a medicine box to treat the wound of the soldier who was shot by the arrow. The soldiers who were searching the abandoned city-state around also noticed this sight. There was a commotion after whispering a few words secretly, but it soon subsided. It was a miracle not to be injured in the army. However, they didn't know who attacked them. Viserys squatted in front of the injured soldier in plain clothes, and his black cloak hung on the ground covered with weeds. What's the situation? He was helping the doctor carefully remove the arrow from the bloody wound of the soldier, but as soon as the arrow was removed, blood gushed out all of a sudden. Viserys quickly blocked the wound with his hand to prevent too much blood from flowing out. Here it comes. At this time, a soldier who was helping nearby brought over the boiling wine. Sir Avan, who was following Viserys, was worried that he had no work to do and couldn't help. Seeing the boiling wine being brought over, he quickly took it from the other party's hand, and then followed the doctor to use it to clean the soldier's wound. Viserys was replaced by the enthusiastic Sir Avan, so he withdrew his bloody hands and washed them in the basin on the other side. to wash off the blood on his hands. As for the injured soldier, the strong stimulating effect of alcohol directly made his dizzy brain sober up. Hiss. The muscles on his face twitched in pain, and the cold sweat on his forehead instantly slid down. However, at this time, he saw Viserys squatting in front of him, and then struggled to sit up, and spoke at the same time. Your Majesty, something bad has happened. We have been attacked by Dothraki. This Rhoynar soldier was one of the scouts sent by Viserys. After leaving the ruined city of Goldo, they continued to explore. Then they came to the Trident River where the Upper Rhoynar River and the Little Rhoynar River meet, where they were attacked by a group of Dothraki. Then a fierce battle broke out between the two sides. In the end, they were outnumbered. The scouts killed 2 Dothraki in the melee, while 3 of their own people were killed. Only he climbed on his warhorse and fled back in embarrassment. Several arrows in his body were shot by Dothraki archers during the pursuit. However, the other side chased all the way, and when they were about to catch up with Goldo, they found the Andalus army hoarding here, and then they dared not continue to pursue forward, stopped and then fled from here. Dothraki? Viserys first held down the injured Rhoynar scout. Let him heal his wounds and don't move. Then he frowned slightly. He didn't expect to encounter Dothraki here. Now they are still far away from the Dothraki Sea. Although Dothraki, as a nomadic people, often come west to the free trade city to plunder wealth. But it is rare to go so far. Viserys thought for a while, then asked, did you see their totems clearly? Dothraki do not have the concept of country and city-state. There are only tribes called khals, and the best way to distinguish these khals is to know what their khals are called. However, if you are not a Dothraki, it is rare to tell which khals the other party is at a glance. You can only tell them by the totems, tattooed on the Dothraki warriors or the painted animal skin vests. Unfortunately, this scout has always lived in his hometown. It is also the first time he has seen these people from the Great Grass Sea, and he cannot tell the difference between them. Your Majesty, when the Dothraki Kalpus move, there must be scouts patrolling ahead, responsible for keeping an eye out for all kinds of prey and enemy traces. At this moment, a familiar voice sounded from behind Viserys. It turned out that when Viserys was lost in thought about the affairs of the Dothraki, a Baron came over from nowhere. At the same time, he was holding his mistress, Illyrius, and the illegitimate daughter of Harmanella, the Earl of Hellgate. In the tribes of the Dothraki, the warriors walk in the front to guard the 2 wings, and the old people, women, and children walk at the end of the Kalpus. A Baron continued to speak, wearing a neat and complicated black dress with gold embroidered patterns on it. Your Majesty, the woman full of exotic charm and sexy characteristics hugged a Baron's arm. Her eyes seemed to have their own charm. She looked at Viserys, then bowed slightly and greeted him. A Baron? Viserys also raised his head when he heard the voice, then stood up and asked, what do you mean? The slender man looked at Viserys with his mistress, his dark eyes like a venomous snake. I think we may have encountered a tribe of Dothraki. If they have enough strength and confidence, they are likely to attack us. If they are not strong enough, they will. However, when a Baron was saying something, a faint and low vibration suddenly came from the ground outside the ruined city of Gordoha in the distance. At the same time, Viserys, a Baron and the soldiers around them all felt the trembling of the ground. At the same time, Your Majesty, tap tap tap. Several soldiers riding war horses fled back from afar, and then turned over and dismounted panting. They were also scouts sent out from the front, and now they came back to report the urgent military situation. However, now they don't have to say anything. If they just said that the Dothraki were coming, then there would be no need to say anything. Viserys secretly said inwardly, oh no, and looked at a Baron at the same time. They didn't know which Khal's Khal this was, but it was certain that the other party must have come with bad intentions. This group of Dothraki, Viserys clenched his fists and ordered the entire army to be on alert and began to shrink the formation on the spot to prepare for the enemy. Do they really have the confidence to defeat us? And his servants also carried out the Little King's armor and helped Viserys put on his own armor on the spot. However, no one except this group of Dothraki could answer Viserys' questions. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel. Mundo fanfic novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 109 Encirclement. Soon, not too long past, in the distance, on the horizon of the ancient Valyrian road, a black line first appeared in people's vision, followed by the huge roar of galloping horses. Rumble, the horses' hooves rolled up the soil on the ground, and the dust drifted in the air, to form a long dragon of smoke, and countless birds around were startled. A large number of Dothraki suddenly broke into the field of vision of the ruined city-state of Goldoho. However, this group of Dothraki seemed to be just the vanguard of this chaos, and the number was not large. They reined in their horses and stopped moving forward when they came to a place several kilometers away from the ruined city-state of Goldoho. This group of Dothraki did not seem to be in a hurry to attack the army of Andalus. They were just far away, without any discipline, and gathered together like a group of flies, looking at this side in a mess, as if they were examining a prey. At the same time, they made inexplicable sharp howls one after another. Viserys didn't understand the Dothraki language and didn't know what the other party was saying, but it was obvious that it was definitely not a good thing. They came too fast. The Dothraki in the distance seemed to be waiting for the follow-up tribesmen. After the initial panic, Andalus's army quickly began to deploy their formations and actively organize defenses. Neither Viserys nor Oberyn expected that this Dothraki chaos would catch up so quickly. It can only be said that they are worthy of being a nation on horseback. It seems that during the scouts' return, this chaos has crossed the river and is rushing in this direction. Then it joined the scout and accelerated. At this time, Viserys also put on the last armor with the help of the servant. Click, a harsh sound of metal friction. The armor was tightly buckled. Then the little king sat on the horse and moved his wrist slightly, then buckled the polished bright silver helmet on his head and pulled down the visor to cover his face. Lance. The attendant standing under the horse quickly raised the little king's most handy weapon and handed it to him. Your Majesty. Then Viserys took the lance, which was slightly heavy, and held it in one hand with 5 fingers slightly clenched. The sharp tip of the 3-edged blade flashed with a chill, and then dropped down, to point directly to the ground. Although he was born noble, Viserys was never afraid of leading the army in person, and even dared to lead the troops to boost morale. Because of the black fog, he had to harvest enough lives to fill it with his own hands. Another reason was that his foundation was so weak now. For Viserys, many things must be done with all his strength, and he could not allow a single failure. Hurry, hurry, hurry. The soldiers surrounding Viserys were also rushing to arrange the formation under his command. Fortunately, Viserys had been maintaining the formation when he led the army forward, so he was not too panicked now. He could quickly rely on the terrain of the ruined city to organize a defensive formation and build simple fortifications. After Viserys put on his armor, he squeezed his legs against the horse's belly and urged the horse to walk to the top of the ruined city. Tap, tap, tap. Then he pulled the reins and stood here looking at the crowd of Dothraki in the distance. Standing on the high ground, Viserys could clearly see that there was still a steady stream of Dothraki coming in the distance. Your Majesty. Suddenly encountering the Dothraki tribe, Ser Avan, a newly promoted Royna noble under the Targaryen forces, who had been following Viserys, also equipped himself with armor, holding an axe in one hand, and then asked, "Why are the Dothraki staying there? Do they want to negotiate with us?" Although Ser Avan was good at flattering, because his former guard Bassi was left in Andalus, and he also needed a local expert, Viserys still promoted him, and personally appointed Avan as a knight. But although this Royna warrior was weak-kneed and easy to surrender, he was indeed very brave in battle. He had a strong body like a black tower, and held a heavy battle axe in his hand. When he was driven as a death squad, he always bravely took the lead, so he was noticed by Viserys. Maybe. Viserys sat upright on the horse, and the slightly cool breeze in the afternoon penetrated into his body through the gaps in the armor. He clenched his 5 fingers slightly, and the sunlight cast his shadow on the ruins below, and the silver-armored white horse stood on the high ground. But this possibility is not great. Faced with the servant's question, Viserys had no better answer, because he didn't know what this group of Dothraki wanted to do. Now they did not surround Goldo, but only blocked the other end. and the gate at the back was completely open. The Dothraki did not attack or send people to negotiate and explain their intentions, and the follow-up reinforcement were still coming. What did they want to do? Retreat? Viserys sat on horseback, and then an idea suddenly flashed through his mind, but he rejected it in an instant. Now the 7,000 plus Andalus army still has a geographical advantage in the ruined city of Goldoha, and can defend the city. If Viserys is frightened by the Dothraki and really withdraws his troops from here and flees, it will probably have disastrous consequences, and he will be chased and killed, or even face the danger of annihilation. The Dothraki are a nation on horseback, and everyone, young and old, is the best cavalry. In addition to the famous Battle of Koha more than 400 years ago, 3,000 Unsullied resisted the attack of more than 50,000 Dothraki led by Temocal under the city of Koha. In addition, there are few cases of defeating the Dothraki in field battles outside the city. The opponent comes and goes like the wind, and if you find that he is a tough guy, you can turn around and run away. The conventional national infantry and cavalry combined army is simply unable to pursue the Dothraki tribe, and can neither catch up nor run away. Therefore, the idea of retreating only flashed through his mind, and then Viserys rejected the idea. However, perhaps he had gathered enough forces, or perhaps he found that this army was not fooled, and was scared to abandon the city and flee. Then the group of Dothraki who gathered more and more beyond the horizon, made a decision for Viserys. In the distance, a Dothraki who looked like a leader rode on a strong long-haired black horse, but it was too far away for Viserys to see clearly, but he felt vaguely familiar. He is. Chapter 110 Battle. He is. The metal of the armor made a friction sound. Viserys sat on the warhorse, grabbed the iron ring on the saddle with one hand, and leaned forward slightly. However, the distance between the two was too far, several kilometers away. Viserys narrowed his lavender eyes, and the complex hexagram pattern was looming in the depths of his eyes. He could only barely see that the other party was different from other Dothraki. He was unusually tall, riding the strongest warhorse, and was surrounded by them. He should be the Khal of this KLS. Then he saw that the Khal drew out his scimitar, the tip of the knife pointed directly at Goldo in the distance, and he seemed to roar. The Dothraki Horse King asked the tribe to irrigate his anger with blood. He wanted to defeat the army led by this sheep man, and then sell them all to the slavers bay in exchange for sufficient weapons and food to strengthen his own tribe. Roar, roar, roar. The Dothraki heard the order from their own Khal, and raised their shining scimitars at the same time. Countless scimitars looked like a forest of knives under the bright sun, and they howled like wolves. The Dothraki's ghostly howling was loud, and could be heard from a long distance. Many people in the Andalus army, who were defending the abandoned city-state in formation, turned pale when they heard the howling. The Dothraki seemed to be very good at this psychological warfare tactic, creating fear all the time, and playing with the enemy's mentality. It was like a pack of wolves encircling a large herbivore, constantly maneuvering until the opponent was intertwined with fear and fatigue, and finally the wolves rushed up to kill the prey. Now the Dothraki psychological warfare tactics seemed to have failed. The commander of the Andalus army seemed to remain calm and there was no big commotion. Therefore, the brave and fearless Khal in this KLS lost his patience to wait any longer, and decided to pounce on the prey and bite its neck himself. Then, with the order of the Horse King, the overwhelming Dothraki rode on their war horses, making inexplicable shrill howls, waving scimitars and ropes in their hands, rushing towards Goldoha like a tsunami. Rumble. The sound of horse hooves was as deafening as thunder, and a black mass of cavalry gradually expanded from the end of the horizon, covering the vision of all Andalus soldiers. Gilu, the soldiers who formed a defensive battle formation and guarded the intersection of the ruins. I don't know who swallowed first. However, at this moment, everyone felt a little dry in the mouth, and even the fear had been temporarily forgotten. The legs stood still and would not move. Now there was only a blank in the brain, and only knew to hold the weapon in his hand tightly and wait for the final arrival of fate. Enemy, attack. Although they had been confronting for a long time. However, there were still Andalus soldiers standing in the front row who sounded the alarm, and the tone was even slightly off, and became sharp and distorted. But more of the sound was covered by the galloping horse hooves. The soldiers could feel the ground under their feet trembling slightly, and the stones even jumped up. Quick! set up the formation. The grassroots officers of Andalus were also managing their own ranks, and the hearts in their chests were beating faster and faster, preparing to meet the first wave of Dothraki attacks. Spearmen. Boom. A row of soldiers with shields raised high set up a shield formation, and the spears in the back were clamped in the gaps of the shields, consolidating into a hedgehog formation that was as airtight as an iron barrel. Facing the charge of the Dothraki, the battle formation that the Andalus army was most adept at using when clearing out bandits, brotherhoods, and conquering Roina villages and towns finally showed its most complete and ferocious state. This was the most powerful test that the Andalus army had faced since its establishment. Ready to engage the enemy. Cry. An eagle spread its wings and flew in the sky. Its sharp eyes reflected the two armies below, which were as clear and distinct as the tide. Looking down from the sky, the Andalus army formed an iron barrel formation like a hedgehog. With the help of the geographical advantage, it first occupied the abandoned city-state of Goldo, guarding all the roads and setting up a strict defense formation. The Dothraki people surged like a tide, heading towards the main entrances of the ruined city. Rumble. The galloping horses rolled up huge dragons of smoke, and the endless Dothraki people rushed to the abandoned city-state. Hiding behind the shield formation, the Andal warriors and the Roina soldiers who had just joined the army each tightly grasped their weapons, their hearts pounding faster and faster, and even their breathing became extremely heavy. The war has begun. Everyone heard the huge sound of thousands of horses galloping outside approaching, and the fear in their hearts could not be stopped. Their throats rolled involuntarily, and they swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Will I die? A soldier from the Roina who had just surrendered not long ago held his weapon in his hand, but his voice was already crying, but he was slapped on the head by the captain next to him. Shut up. Everyone was very nervous at this time. The most feared thing was that someone would affect the emotions of the people around him, and then cause irreversible effects, but fortunately it was stopped in time. No one would not be frightened in the face of such a scene, and even wanted to turn around and run away. However, the Andalus soldiers who had been in battle for a long time knew that, if they turned around and ran away now, causing the formation of the entire army to collapse, they would probably die faster. At that time, the Dothraka's butcher knife would harvest their fragile lives without hindrance. Those who surrendered would be captured as slaves, doing hard labor for the rest of their lives, or dying in the arena. Soon, the Dothraki who were rushing over were about to enter the range of the Andalus archers. Archers. The grassroots officers in charge of small-scale command operations ordered the archers protecting the rear of the formation to draw their bows and arrows. Ready. Click. All the Andalus archers began to draw their bows and arrows, pulling the bowstrings and aiming at the sky at a 45-degree angle, preparing to launch the first round of arrow rain to deal with the huge target formed by the enemy gathering in groups. Fire. Then there was a pause for a second, followed by the commander's order. Bang. Countless bowstrings burst out with sounds. A large black mass of arrows flew into the sky and then fell rapidly to form a rain of arrows that covered the sky and the sun and rushed directly to the Dothraki warriors who were rushing head on. Chapter 111 Drogo. Because as a traditional nomadic people who mainly rely on plunder for a living, the Dothraki people are not very civilized and do not have the corresponding smelting technology. The Dothraki people only have light cavalry, equipped with air axiometers and short bows adapted to horseback archery. They do not wear any protective gear including shields, helmets, and armor, and regard warriors wearing armor as cowards. Therefore, puff puff puff, a black rain of arrows fell head on, instantly setting off a bloody storm. People shouted and horses neighed. Countless Dothraki warriors who were charging at the front were shot, and even fell off their horses, and some horses were shot, and fell to the ground. The momentum of the Dothraka's high-speed charge was obviously curbed for a while, but the Dothraki who continued to pour in from the back did not stop at all, and did not care about their companions who fell off their horses. They directly blindfolded their horses, and continued to rush forward. The Dothraki who were further behind took off the short bows on their waists, while charging on horseback, drew their bows, and put arrows on them, and also used the method of projectiles, to bypass the frontmost shield formation and projectiles to the Andalus archers hiding behind the shield formation. Bang, bang, bang. However, the Dothraki had loose discipline and chaotic command, and it was obvious that they did not know how to fire in volleys, and it was extremely difficult to shoot on horseback. Some of the scattered arrows flew over and fell into the shield formation, causing some casualties among the Andalus archers. This was the Dothraki's way of fighting. When facing long-range attacks, they had to rush forward at the fastest speed. As for the pain in the middle, the other side would pay them back twice when the two sides fought hand to hand. Roar, roar, roar. After being injured and seeing blood, these Dothraki were not afraid, but were like bloodthirsty beasts, which further aroused the madness in their blood. One by one, they shook the scimitars in their hands and let out more excited howls. Rumble, the horses' hooves stepped on the muddy land, and they continued to charge forward fearlessly. Some of the companions who were shot and fell off their horses were pulled up to their horses by the tribesmen behind them, while more were trampled into meat paste by the chaotic horses' hooves, and their blood and flesh were forever integrated with the land. These Dothrakis, Viserys took a deep breath when he saw this scene, while sitting on horseback. He had to admit that these Dothrakis were really brave and fearless. He was a little worried whether the Andalus army, which had undergone such a big test for the first time, could withstand such a strong impact. This sudden encounter, neither side had any strategies to prepare, and there was only a test of the fighting quality of the soldiers on both sides. The Dothraki attacked, while the Andalus relied on the rubble of the ruined city to defend. I hope so. Click, the 5 fingers of the little king wearing the steel gloves clenched slightly. The warhorse under his crotch made a restless whistle and kicked its hooves twice. It seemed that he was dissatisfied with the fact that his master was just standing here to command and did not personally go out. But it was not just him who did not go out personally. Viserys was also searching for something among the Dothraki, but he couldn't find the cow. HMPH. Cunning. The little king narrowed his eyes. It is said that when the Dothraki fight, the cows always charge in front, but if the Dothraki's fighting style is really followed, the cows who always charge in the front may really become disposable items that are frequently replaced. Then, this cow finally collided head-on with the iron barrel formation formed by the Andalus army. The Dothraki, who were spread out on the ground like a vast ocean, were forced to shrink their formation after entering this ruined city-state and poured into the avenues. The formation was forced to split into several groups. The Dothraki who rushed in the front blindfolded their horses to give them the courage to face the sharpness of the spears. The next second, the entire battlefield seemed to have stopped for a second before the collision, and then there was a huge sound like a landslide. Boom. The high-speed galloping warhorses brought with them a powerful impact force and directly tore several wounds in the seemingly impregnable iron barrel formation of the Andalus army. At the same time, the chaotic and noisy sounds of people shouting and horses neighing filled people's eardrums, and the eyes were dyed red with blood, and everyone's adrenaline began to soar. Kill. While the Dothraki used their flesh and blood to break through the iron barrel formation, they supported themselves on the ground with sharp spears and dug open the bellies of these warhorses without any hindrance, and the intestines in the stomachs flowed all over the ground. The Dothraki warriors who fell off the horses were either ruthlessly trampled by the iron hooves that followed, or were pierced into sieves by the spears of the Andalus soldiers who swarmed up from the back. Kill them. Puff. An Andalus soldier pierced a Dothraki warrior's chest with a spear. The opponent was naked from the waist up. His bronze skin was covered in blood, his long black hair was messy, and he let out a rough roar that was hard to understand. At the same time, he held a scimitar in his hand and wanted to kill the opponent, even if the spear pierced his body. This veteran Andalus soldier gritted his teeth slightly, loosened the spear in his hand, drew a dagger from his waist, and then chopped off the opponent's head with one sword. The equipment of Andalus soldiers was not that good. It was not as rich as the Riverbend, and some ordinary soldiers were equipped with plate armor. Most ordinary soldiers in Andalus were equipped with light armor. In winter, they covered themselves with animal skins to keep warm, and took off the animal skins when the weather got hot. As for weapons, the dagger was standard. Every soldier, including archers and spearmen, had a dagger on his waist. There were also special sword and shield soldiers, holding a shield in one hand and a sword in the other, standing at the forefront of the formation. Because Andalus is surrounded by mountains on 3 sides, it is not short of wood, so there are a lot of resources. to make spears and shields. This is why Andalus was once called the Wooden City. On the other side, the soldier who was hiding behind the shield array and stabbing out with a spear was suddenly caught by a rope falling from the sky. Raw. Then, the man riding on the black long-haired warhorse outside had deep eyes and then pulled the muscles on his arms hard to bulge. Caught off guard, coupled with powerful strength. Boom. He actually pulled the Andalus soldier out of the shield array directly, and a wound was broken in the solid shield array in an instant. Drogo. Drogo. There was a deafening cheer from the Dothraki, and then they rushed up along the crack that Drogo had torn for them. The solid iron barrel array became somewhat precarious. And at this time, Your Majesty, a soldier on a fast horse climbed up to the hill where Viserys was standing. However, just as he was about to say something, he was stopped by Viserys because he had seen everything. Chapter 112 Night. Soon, after half a day of fighting, night finally fell. The bloodthirsty and excited Dothraki, as if they had taken stimulants, finally couldn't hold on any longer. The howling gradually weakened, and fatigue gradually filled their whole bodies. Their feet seemed to be stuck in the mud, and they couldn't swing the scimitars in their hands. Beep. Then, accompanied by the sound of retreat horns from behind KLS, all the Dothraki finally stepped on the afterglow of the dusk, threw away the corpses on the ground, and began to slowly retreat. The Andalus army had long been exhausted and unable to catch up with the retreating enemy. They could only watch the group of Dothraki evacuate the battlefield with numb and stiff eyes. Doctor! Doctor! Come quickly! In the ruined city state of Goldo, the footsteps of soldiers hurried past in a disorderly manner, and the air was full of pungent blood. The wounded soldiers kept wailing, as if they were in the 7 layers of hell. Viserys' body was also stained with blood, and the blade of the long sword in his hand was also a little bent. He gasped and then threw it to the ground. Clang clang clang. At the last moment of the war, when the Andalus army was on the verge of collapse, the Little King personally took up his sword and resisted the last wave of attacks from the Dothraki, boosting the morale of the entire army. In the end, he led the Andalus army to win the will contest between the two sides. The Dothraki, who had been actively attacking and suffered heavy losses, finally couldn't stand it anymore and took the lead in blowing the horn of retreat, giving the Andalus people on the verge of collapse some breathing space. Now this highly tense string in the brain has finally relaxed, and the Andalus soldiers feel a strong fatigue surging into their hearts, and the fear and pain of injury all come out at once. Soldiers who had rested in the rear replaced the soldiers who had just withdrawn from the battlefield. Many of them leaned against the wall or the big tree and fell asleep. Some even found a piece of soft land and lay on the ground and never wanted to get up again. Soldiers who were slightly injured were given boiling wine and cloth bandages to treat their wounds by themselves, while soldiers who were seriously injured and missing arms and legs were either being rescued by doctors or carried away by other soldiers to find a deserted place to send him off, or quietly waiting for death to come so as not to affect the emotions of others. At this moment, Viserys took off the armor on his upper body. His silver gold hair, which used to be elegant, was now a little felted and wet with sweat accumulated in the armor. It was now tightly attached to his cheeks and back. He was sitting alone on a stone in a ruined city, silently sorting out his equipment, and at the same time looking up at the hellish appearance around him, and I don't know what he was thinking. At this moment, a voice sounded from behind him. This is the truest form of war, Viserys. It is not comparable to the siege of some villages and towns and bandits. A Baron had also taken off his armor and wiped off the dirt on his body. For the first time, his dark eyes, like those of a venomous snake, showed clear fatigue. Just now, a Baron had been fighting on the front line and even briefly fought with Khal Drogo to stop the other party's arrogance. However, in the chaotic battle, both sides could not stretch their fists and feet, and could only be swept away by the momentum of the army. In the end, in the chaos, Khal Drogo withdrew from the front line of the battlefield under the protection of his blood guards, and the fight between the two came to an abrupt end. When Viserys personally went into battle, the war had already entered its end. The Dothraki only had the last wave of madness left. Khal Drogo had already retreated to the rear under protection, and the two did not meet each other. Well, you are right. Viserys heard a Baron's voice, and raised his head slightly to look at him. Then he lowered his head, took off the greaves on his legs, and threw them on the ground. But why do you appear from behind me every time? Viserys even suspected that Oberyn deliberately walked around every time he saw him, just to scare him. His words obviously made the Dornish prince's cheeks stiffen slightly, and then he shrugged helplessly. Believe me, it's just a coincidence. Then he sat side by side on the stone next to him, and turned his head to look at the little king. But I'm relieved to see that you are not frightened by the cruelty of this war. Oberyn's words were obviously a joke. Viserys had witnessed the cruelty of war since he was very young. When he was 7 or 8 years old, he had killed several people with his own hands. Naturally, he would not be frightened at this time. However, Oberyn was also reminding Viserys in a teasing way not to be overwhelmed by the cruelty of war and to maintain the most basic calmness. Although Viserys was not very old, he had become the backbone of the entire Targaryen interest group and the most indispensable person. Neither Rhaenys nor Daenerys can replace Viserys' important role in this interest group, which is why King Robert has been trying so hard to kill him. The reason why Oberyn stayed in Andalus was that he hoped to avenge his sister one day, and this hope became more and more real as Viserys grew older and Andalus grew stronger. However, Viserys just shook his head at Oberyn's concerns, and he was naturally not scared. I'm just thinking about how to win this battle. Even if the connection of fate is put aside, and he will become the most powerful KLS in the Dothraki Sea in the future, the contradiction between Viserys and Rogo will not be easily broken. We have to find a way to kill this guy. Finally, the little king clenched his fist slightly and made up his mind. In the distance, a bronze-skinned and strong man sat on a black warhorse, his upper body naked, revealing his twisted muscles, and his long braids tied with small bells made a slight sound in the wind. He had a pair of deep black eyes, and he rode his horse high up to look at the battlefield in the distance. His eyes were calm, and then he raised his hand and made a sound similar to hum. The expression was very simple, but the meaning was clear. The blood guard Khal Ro who followed him naturally knew Khal Drogo very well. Khal Ro was an old subordinate of his father and had rescued Drogo from the hands of mercenaries when he was a child. Then the short fat bald man with a mouth full of broken teeth nodded slightly, turned his horse's head and ran down. Chapter 113 Challenge. And not long after, beep, the horn of retreat was finally blown, and countless Dothraki warriors who were fighting on the front line until they were exhausted finally breathed a sigh of relief, and then slowly evacuated the solid reef of Gordo like the sea receding. The command of the Dothraki was very simple, so simple that everyone could hear the order of the Khal: charge or retreat. And it was a rare situation for the Dothraki to fail to take down the enemy in a wave. The free trade cities around the Dothraki Sea would hardly take the initiative to go out of the city to fight. They huddled in the city walls, and the soldiers had long lost the courage to fight the Dothraki in the wild. They would only use money to send away these horse kings who went west to beg for money. Since the problem can be solved with money, it is not a problem in their eyes. And the Khals who accepted the gift will not come again in a short time. But how long this time is depends on the greed of each Khal. After Khal Drogo unified his father's old tribe, he defeated 2 weak Khals in succession on the Great Grass Sea, killed their Khals, and expanded the size of the tribe. Therefore, the Dothraki are the most brave and warlike warriors, because they are fighting all the time, and only fighting and killing can make them stronger. This time, Khal Drogo led his Khals westward to harvest some Rhoynar villages, capture some slaves for their own use or sell them to the slave bay in exchange for food and weapons. However, Khal Drogo led his Khals up the Kin River to the city of Nassastar, which was once the capital of the Rhoynar people, and is now abandoned. Here, he harvested a wave of villages and towns. Then he continued to go up along the Rhoynar River to the upper Rhoynar River basin, but found that it had long been deserted, and had been completely swept. All the Rhoynar along the way left their homes, and rushed to the direction of Andalus. Viserys provided them with shelter and a series of preferential policies, just in time to avoid Khal Drogo's cleanup this time. The Horse King, who had gained nothing, was naturally unwilling to give up, so he continued to track the whereabouts of these villages, and finally blocked the culprits in the ruined city of Gordo on the banks of the Three Forks River. These people dared to pull teeth from his tiger's mouth. So Khal Drogo led the Khals to attack without saying a word, demanding to use the blood of these lambs to extinguish his anger. However, He originally thought that these soldiers would be rotten to the root like the defenders of the other free trade cities and had no fighting power. However, he did not expect that the other side would finally hold on to the end after several shaky times. Seeing that the losses of the strong attack were too heavy, Drogo could only order his subordinates to blow the horn of retreat. The marching and fighting of the Dothraki were extremely simple. The stitched animal's content was the residence of the cow, and there was a light inside, while the rest of the tribesmen dug holes in the ground and used straw sandals as roofs to rest. The boiling horse meat in the pot gave off a bad smell. These were dead horses. The Dothraki people were not afraid to eat horse meat and drink fermented horse milk. In the high tent of the cow, there were black sausages, blood pies and beetroot soup, and waves of fragrance came out. Deng deng deng. At this moment, a hurried sound of footsteps came from outside, and then a man opened the curtain and walked in. It was the leader of a group of Cass. And a moment later, a chaotic noise came from the tent. It turned out that he was questioning why Khal Drogo suddenly ordered a retreat, and it was clear that if they held on for a while, the lambs on the opposite side would collapse. However, several blood guards standing behind Drogo heard that this bandit dared to speak rudely to the cow, and they all drew their scimitars at their waists. For the first time, an angry expression appeared on Drogo's cold face, and then he stood up from behind the table in the tent. No matter whether they won or lost the battle, no one could question the authority and orders of the cow, otherwise they would be challenging the position of the cow and want to be the cow themselves. This was the rule of the Dothraki. Moreover, he was only slightly frustrated and had not lost the battle, but someone could not wait to jump out and challenge him. Drogo was naturally very angry in the face of the challenge, and his dark eyes were filled with clear murderous intent. The other party's face was obviously a little more unnatural. He did want to challenge the cow, but he was actually a little nervous in the face of Drogo's fierce reputation. But Drogo had already accepted his challenge, spread his hands without any weapons in his hands, and looked like he was defenseless, and walked towards the bandit openly. He raised his chin and signaled the other party to draw his scimitar. In the face of Drogo's humiliation, as a warlike Dothraki, the leader of the Cass finally couldn't bear it anymore, drew the scimitar at his waist, and roared. Then he rushed towards the unarmed Drogo. Drogo was so arrogant that he wanted to fight him with his bare hands, so he took this opportunity to kill him and become the cow himself. However, it didn't take too long. Maybe just a few seconds. Puff, blood suddenly sprayed on the animal's content, and then slowly slid down a blood mark. Looking into the tent from the outside, you can see that the tall figure is still standing there, and the Khor who challenged Drogo actually stabbed his neck with a scimitar. The body knelt on the spot, with his waist backward, and his body showed an unattainable weird twisted angle. The bones of his wrists were crushed. Then several Dothraki came in from outside, dragged the body out of the tent, and threw it into the wilderness. Soon, another period of time passed. Two Dothraki came out of the tent, one of whom was Khal Drogo's blood guard Kotho, and the other seemed to be his follower. Then the two men turned on their horses and ran straight in the direction of Goldoha. Knight. Among Andalus's soldiers, there is a young warrior. He is me, a former friend of Bessie, a knight who is a guard of Viserys. However, their life experiences are different. His friend was canonized as a knight by His Majesty the King for his bravery in battle, and became a nobleman, while he is still an unknown captain in the army. The family gap between the two is also obvious. Bess's mother also moved into the castle to live, managing some servants, and taking care of the two princesses on weekdays. Me has nothing, because of his timidity, but it is also for this reason, that many familiar faces around him have disappeared, but he is still alive, and has become a veteran. Now he is leading some soldiers who were rotated not long ago, to dig holes in the soft soil in front of the battle. Digging holes? Me doesn't know why His Majesty the King ordered this, but the reality is so fucked up. Chapter 114 The Messenger. At this moment, they were blowing in the night wind, smelling the stench in the air, using the corpses of Dothraki and war horses as roadblocks. And they dug holes in the ground that were only as thick as an ordinary arm. No, a little thicker than an arm, perhaps only as big as a horse's calf. Hey. The Andal youth with messy hair blown by the wind stood on the land outside the city of Jidoho. There were more soldiers around him doing the same work, that is, digging holes in the ground. He felt that he seemed to vaguely understand the reason for the king's order. At this time, tap tap tap, a subtle sound of horse hooves sounded, coming from far away. His ears moved slightly, as if he heard something, and then he raised his head first. As expected of an old man who had escaped death several times on the battlefield, vigilance always comes first. Far away, in the dark wilderness, the young Endless soldier could vaguely see two Dothrakis riding war horses approaching quickly in the faint moonlight. Who are you? The Andalus soldiers who were digging holes nearby also discovered the other party at this time, and they became alert in an instant, putting down their shovels and picks, and drawing their short swords. Stop. However, just when the Andalus soldiers were startled and highly nervous, under the faint moonlight, they saw that the two Dothrakis whose faces could not be seen suddenly disappeared from their sight. Huh? Where did they go? Me scratched his head slightly. He suspected that he was dazzled. How could two living people suddenly disappear? However, he turned his head and looked at the brothers around him and found that they seemed to be confused as well. However, they heard the painful neighing of the war horses and the incomprehensible sound of gibberish. It didn't sound like a good word, as if they were cursing something. Some special situation suddenly appeared here and soon attracted the soldiers holding torches in the back. Torches. Mir adjusted the helmet on his head and then took the torch from the hands of others. A group of Andalus soldiers drew their swords and carefully surrounded the place where the sound came from. Then they walked closer and found two horses with broken legs lying on the ground and neighing in pain. The masters on their backs were also thrown hard and knocked unconscious. At this moment, two Dothraki with braids were sitting on the ground rubbing their heads. It's the Dothraki. The faces of the Andalus soldiers were instantly filled with anger and hatred. I don't know how many brothers died in the hands of the Dothraki in the fierce battle during the day, and among them were Andals and Roina. The Andals were better because they were far away and almost did not suffer from the attacks of the Dothraki. However, the Roina village was closer to the Great Grass Sea, and many Roina had been attacked by these barbarians. Even if we ignore the fighting during the day, there was a deep hatred, and the Andalus soldiers' eyes turned red in an instant. It seems that they are here to spy on intelligence. Kill them. A group of Andalus soldiers drew their daggers and rushed to kill the two Dothraki spies. Among the two Dothraki, Khal Drogo's blood guard Kotho was also thrown to the ground, and his brain was still a little dizzy. He was just riding a warhorse and humming a song, but he didn't expect to fall into a pit suddenly. Who can react to this? Not to mention him, even Khal Drogo would fall to the ground. Before Kotho could fully react, they were surrounded by a group of Andalus people holding torches and weapons. Although he couldn't understand what the other party was mumbling, Kotho was not a fool. Judging from the other party's excited look, it didn't seem like he was saying anything good. Then the group of lambs had red eyes and seemed to want to pounce on them and chew them alive. Although Kotho was a little dazed after falling, he also shuddered at this time, hurriedly climbed up from the ground, drew the scimitar at his waist, and put on a look of fighting to the death. However, just when the two sides were about to have a conflict, another Dothraki with Kotho suddenly spoke in the poor common language of Westeros. Hey, stop. We are the messengers of Khal Drogo. Take us to see you. The common language of this Dothraki sounded a bit difficult to understand, but the Andalus soldiers present still understood it. The other party did not seem to know Andalus very well, and did not know how to address the master of Andalus. Take me to see your governor. Finally, the Dothraki was so embarrassed that his face turned red and his neck became thick, that he finally figured out what he thought was the correct address. However, although the soldiers of Andalus stopped their work after hearing that the other party was an envoy, they could not help but look at each other in confusion when they heard that the other party was looking for the governor of Andalus. Governor? Where can we get a governor here? Fortunately, Mir understood what the other party said and took the initiative to stand up at this time to help the Dothraki translator out of the siege. Okay, it seems that these two envoys are here to negotiate with our king. The misunderstanding was finally resolved. Afterwards, me took the two Dothraki envoys back to Goldoho's camp. After just experiencing a false alarm, the Dothraki translator was okay. After all, he could barely understand what these Andals and Roina said, and the mental pressure was not that great. and Khal Drogo's blood guard Kotho was highly nervous, like a frightened cat, looking around vigilantly throughout the whole process, and would alertly put his hand on the hilt of the knife at his waist at the slightest sign of trouble. Not long after that, 2 Dothraki messengers were brought into Viserys' tent. It was almost late at night, but the little king hadn't rested yet. He was much more energetic than the others. There was half a burning white wax on the table. At this moment, he was in his tent, looking at the marching map on the table, thinking about how to defeat the enemy, while on the surface, Viserys seemed to be staring at the map in a daze. At this time, the guards guarding outside the tent came in, and whispered a few words in Viserys' ear. HMM. The little king raised his head slightly, his lavender eyes sparkling. Then he lowered his head to look at the map on the table, pondered for a while, and finally nodded. Let them in. Chapter 115 Challenge. Soon, 2 Dothraki envoys were brought into Viserys' tent. The little king sat on his bed, wearing a soft cloak. His long hair was not tied up, and was freely scattered behind his back, and he looked at the 2 envoys calmly. It can be seen that the interesting thing is that the one walking in front of the 2 Dothraki has a gloomy look and an arrogant face, while the one walking behind has a humble expression, showing an opposite attitude. There are 2 completely different attitudes when they are on a mission together. Which one can better represent Drogo's will? Your Excellency Governor. At this time, the Dothraki who was walking behind took the lead in bowing and saluting with one hand on his chest, using the common etiquette on the Essos continent, and speaking the common language of Westeros, and calling Viserys the unique title of governor only in the free trade city, which looks a bit lame and funny. However, Viserys just raised his eyebrows slightly, still sitting on his bed, and looking at the 2 people who came in, and then nodded. Please sit down. But before Viserys could finish his words, the Dothraki who was walking in front walked to the side, and sat on a cushion beside Viserys' bed. How dare you? The guards in the tent were furious when they saw this scene. They were about to scold him, but Viserys stopped them with his eyes. Then the little king withdrew his gaze, and looked at the Dothraki with interest. The other's face was arrogant and his eyes were gloomy. From his appearance alone, he knew that he was a cruel person. He had witnessed the arrogance of the Dothraki half a year ago. No, a year ago. Drogo's father, Khal Balbok, only brought a few blood guards to attend the banquet in Pentos. He rushed directly to the throne of ivory and gold, and scared the Prince of Pentos to pee his pants. Then he sat on the throne himself, and the governors of Pentos didn't even dare to fart. Compared to Khal Balbo at that time, this man's arrogance has been restrained a lot. At least he didn't dare to break into the tent and ask to sit in his seat. Viserys looked him up and down, and then chuckled. Khal Drogo's blood-ridder Kotho was also looking at Viserys at the same time. He could see that the elegant and noble boy in front of him was not very old, and even a little immature. Perhaps in his tribe, he was just old enough to be a warrior. However, although the other party's smile was clean, he didn't know why he felt particularly awkward, as if he was laughing at him. But once he had this idea in his mind, he felt that the smile on Viserys' face was a mockery. Kotho's face suddenly showed anger. This boy had been laughing at him, and he didn't even stop. However, Kotho wanted to get angry several times, but in the end he thought of the lambs that just surrounded him, as if they wanted to eat him, and finally he didn't dare to slam the table to get angry. He adjusted his sitting position awkwardly, grabbed a troublesome flea from his neck, and then stated the topic directly without any extra nonsense, speaking in Dothraki with a stiff tone. Dothraki has many stressed syllables, which sounds relatively strong, and Viserys couldn't understand what the other party was saying, so he turned his head and looked at the translator. The Dothraki translator heard Kotho's words and cold sweat slid down his forehead. Not all Dothraki people were brainless and reckless. There were brave and fearless people, and there were also relatively less courageous people. However, the main reason why he was able to survive was that he did not live in the living environment of Dothraki since he was a child, but lived as a slave in the Golden Company. The master he served seemed to be an exiled nobleman from Westeros. Later, he was purchased by another Khal and was specifically responsible for translation. But now that Kotho had spoken, he could only bite the bullet and translate according to his meaning. My lord governor, Khal Drogo demands at least 3,000 slaves and 10,000 gold coins. If his losses are compensated, he will be willing to leave here. The translation was a bit awkward, and the words used in many places were awkward, but Viserys still understood what he said. 3,000 slaves. 10,000 gold coins. Although Essos also collects gold dragons, there are also various currencies. Almost every free trade city-state has its own currency, including the brilliant coins and gold marks of Karth and Volantis. In addition to the round ones, there are also oblong ones, triangular ones, and prismatic ones. Although Viserys had been prepared for a long time, he was still surprised by Drogo's lion-like mouth. Too much. Then he shook his head and showed a self-deprecating smile on his face. It seems that Khal Drogo really thinks I'm a rich man. In this case, if we can't reach an agreement, then push them down and kill them. The little king looked at the guards on his left and right, and then spoke calmly and ordered, I can't afford this. I won't hand over my people as slaves either. The guards standing on the left and right sides of the tent drew their short swords and put them on the necks of the two Dothraki men. When they heard Viserys' order, they didn't even have a chance to resist. They were to drag the two men out and kill them according to the king's order. The Dothraki translator was frightened to death. He naturally understood what Viserys said. He didn't expect that this young governor who was smiling on the surface would turn his face and catch people off guard. Others negotiated with sky-high prices and paid them low. Everything could be negotiated, but they never expected that Viserys would say that he had no money and no people, and then he would kill people with a knife. Kotho, Drogo's bloodridder, didn't understand what Viserys was saying. Before the translator even had time to speak, he had been put on the neck by the guards on both sides. But at this time, there was no need for a translator. Kotho understood everything instantly. The proud Dothraki still had no fear on his face at this moment, but turned into madness. His gloomy eyes were fixed on Viserys, who was yelling something, and it seemed that he wanted to struggle. The translator trembled and did not dare to translate Kotho's threat, saying that Khal Drogo would avenge them and kill all the lambs. However, the bloodridder was still talking and glared at the translator, then said a few more words. The translator was stunned for a moment, then reacted and nodded quickly and spoke loudly to Viserys. Mr. Governor, Mr. Kotho challenges you according to the tradition of the Dothraki. If Lord Kotho can win, I hope you can let us go. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 116, Anger, New Year Update. However, the last sentence was added by the translator on his own initiative, because he still wanted to live, and didn't want to die. When Viserys heard the Dothraki's request, he was slightly stunned at first, then reacted, and couldn't help but smile on his handsome face. Okay, I accept your challenge. Then the little king stood up, took a long sword from a guard, and signaled the guards around him who were forcing the blood guard Kotho with swords to retreat. When the guards saw that His Majesty the King readily agreed, they had to do so, but in fact they had nothing to worry about Viserys. Because everyone in Andalus knew Viserys' title of Silver Prince. This title once belonged to Viserys' brother Rhaegar Targaryen. However, now this title is also crowned on Viserys' head, and the story of the little king killing people at the age of 7 is even more praised as a representative of ruthlessness and martial arts. At the same time, because Viserys is not yet an adult, there has always been a habit of calling him Prince. But it was obvious that Viserys' reputation was only spread within the Andalus plains. Perhaps it was spread to several free trade cities around Andalus, such as Pentus, Bravus, and Norvus, along with a movement of caravans. The Dothraki were naturally not among them. They believed that all warriors came from the Great Grass Sea, and looked down on other ethnic groups. Khal Drogo's bloodridder Kotho was released from his restrictions. He moved his shoulders slightly, then twisted his neck, and the joints of his neck made a crackling sound. In fact, he was also a little surprised. He originally thought that the other party would never dare to accept his challenge, but was just struggling before death. However, since this young man had the courage to accept his challenge, Kotho's eyes were gloomy and flashed with a fierce light. Of course, he didn't want to die. No one wanted to die. What he wanted now was to kidnap the young man in this battle and take this opportunity to escape from here. This was the only way for him to escape from Goldoha's death. He even had a chance to capture the other party directly in front of Khal Drogo, making a great contribution, and perhaps in exchange for a few beautiful. The more Kotho thought about it, the more he felt that this matter was reliable, and it all stemmed from the boy's arrogance. At his age, he was just qualified to become a Dothraki warrior in the tribe. For such a rookie, did he really think that he would be safe with guards around him? Kotho was not a waste to be one of Drogo's bloodridders. His hands were extremely dexterous. He could use two air axes at the same time and accurately cut the enemy's throat. Therefore, Kotho was very confident in his own strength. He would not kill the boy. He believed that he could capture him alive. Kotho challenged Viserys, and the guards took another Dothraki to the side and gave up the middle field. Fortunately, Viserys' tent was big enough, otherwise he couldn't even stretch his fists and feet. The bloodridder moved his wrists for the last time, and then finally pulled out his arak from his waist, and then rushed forward, making a strange roar. The young bloodridder slashed directly at Viserys' neck, while the elegant silver-haired boy stood quietly with his sword in one hand, watching the other party rushing over with a pair of lavender eyes. Then he lightly flashed his feet and easily dodged the other party's rushing knife. Kotho staggered and rushed out, and then froze for a moment. He didn't expect Viserys to dodge so easily and just avoid his knife. Coincidence? Then Khal Drogo's bloodridder's face once again showed a hideous look, like an angry vicious dog, roaring and rushing forward again with a scimitar in hand. However, this time, Viserys dodged it flexibly. What's going on? Kotho is not a fool. By now, he had discovered that Viserys was not as easy to deal with as he had imagined. He felt a little nervous and even had a bad feeling. Kotho held the arak in his hand and stared at the figure of the Silver Prince. He felt more pressure in his heart and his breathing became heavier. His chest rose and fell slightly. He vowed to see Viserys' dodge clearly this time. Then, the right-hand man of Khal Drogo roared again and rushed forward for the third time. Viserys decided not to play with the Dothraki warrior this time. His hysterical figure was reflected in his lavender eyes. Then he dodged his knife again and slashed out with the guard's long sword in one hand. Puff! Viserys slashed Kotho's wrist holding the arak with his sword and directly chopped off his right hand. Blood gushed out, and the scimitar in his hand fell to the ground with his chopped right hand, making a sound. Clang clang clang. The battle in the field was relaxed and pleasant. Viserys was playing with the opponent, and every guard present could see it, so they had already put their minds at ease. Kotho was like a trapped beast, trying desperately to struggle, but in the end Viserys chopped off one of his hands with a sword. A hand was chopped off in the battle, and the intense pain suddenly erupted, sweeping through Kotho's brain like a tsunami. In an instant, the Dothraki's eyes widened, cold sweat slid down his forehead, and the muscles on his cheeks were throbbing. Then Kotho let out a painful roar, and fell to his knees with a plop. The only remaining hand tightly grasped the bare arm. Blood was still pouring out, and the expression on his face was so painful that it was even slightly distorted. Viserys looked at Kotho's painful appearance, and this time he did not show any mercy. He held the bloody hilt with both hands, and raised it high again. Puff! The next second, blood spurted up like a fountain again, even splashing on the top of the tent. Gurgle, and the head of Kotho, the blood guard of Khal Drogo, also rolled to the ground. At this time, Prince Oberyn. The voice of the guard came from outside Viserys' tent. Then Oberyn opened the curtain of the tent and walked in, just in time to see the bloody scene where Viserys chopped off the head of the blood guard with his last sword. Oberyn looked up with a little surprise, looking at Viserys who killed a person without even blinking. Then he saw Viserys handing the bloody long sword back to the guard just now, and then took a handkerchief and wiped his hands. Oberyn was silent for a moment, as if he was thinking about something. Then he finally asked, "You seem to want to anger Khal Drogo. Why? Happy New Year, friends." Chapter 117 Rage. Why? Viserys turned around and glanced at Oberyn who had come running after hearing the news. He was wiping the blood off his hands at the moment, then retracted his gaze and spoke calmly. "To kill him, of course." Hearing the little king's words, the Dornishman's narrow and thin eyebrows slightly frowned. He heard the murderous intent in Vizira's voice. It was reasonable for the two armies to want to kill each other, but he always felt that there was a deeper meaning in Vizira's words. "Do you have any grudges with this Dothraki Horse King?" Oberyn asked in a somewhat strange tone. "No." Vizira shook his head. It was obvious that he was not telling the truth. However, the only intersection between Viserys and Rogo now was at the banquet in Pentus, and the two of them only met once, without even saying a word, so it was not right to force a grudge. "Really?" Oberyn raised his eyebrows slightly and nodded. The guards who were shuttling around the tent had already picked up Kotho's head, and the headless body was dragged out, leaving a clear blood stain on the ground. The other guards went to fetch a bucket of water, and hurried to wash the dirt from Viserys' tent. Seeing that Khal Drogo's blood ridders were beheaded by the young and elegant boy in front of him, there was not even a trace of strangeness on his handsome face, as if it was just a normal thing to eat and drink. The other Dothraki translator who was still being held was almost scared to pee his pants. Fortunately, he was sold to the Golden Group as a slave when he was young, otherwise he would not have survived in the Dothraki tribe. "Your Majesty, what should we do with this person?" a guard who was holding the Dothraki asked. Viserys returned the blood-stained handkerchief in his hand to the guard beside him, and glanced at the trembling Dothraki translator. He had even forgotten about this person just now. However, to anger Drogo, one only needs the head of his bloodridder. This translator is actually dispensable, and there is no one in Viserys' army who can speak Dothraki, so his ability may be useful. If he wants to live, give him a chance. Viserys glanced at him and spoke calmly. When the Dothraki translator heard that Viserys was willing to give him a chance to live, he nodded like a chicken pecking at rice. I do. Then Viserys waved his hand, and the translator was taken away by the guards. Oberyn stood there, stroking the soft beard on his chin, looking at Viserys' back, and then opened his mouth, as if he wanted to ask something, but in the end he didn't ask. The next morning, several Andalus knights riding fast horses, holding the head of Kotho, the bloodridder of Khal Drogo, on the tip of their spears, came to the Dothraki's simple tent. They reined in their horses at a distance, shouted a few times, and threw Kotho's head on the ground. The Dothraki in the distance were furious when they saw these lambs dared to ride horses to provoke them. Several hot-tempered Dothraki warriors climbed on their horses with their upper bodies naked, and chased after them. However, the Knights of Andalus were far away, and escaped in advance. The other side learned a lesson, and did not dare to move forward, until they came to the place where they had just stopped, and then they found a lonely head on the ground. Stop. As a blood guard of the Khal, Kotho was naturally known by many of the Khal's tribesmen. When they saw Kotho's head, the Dothraki who chased after them immediately felt that something was wrong. The blood guards are not only guards for every Khal, but also brothers and partners in life and death. The relationship between them is stronger than golden stone. In the daily affairs of the Khal, the bloodridders will always be by his side. The ancient Dothraki tradition requires them to follow the Khal when he dies. If the Khal dies in battle, the bloodridders will do their best to avenge him in the rest of their lives, and then commit suicide after revenge. A Khal and his bloodridders can share everything except mounts, even his wife, sleep in the same tent, and drink from the same cup of wine. But now Khal Drogo's blood of my blood has been beheaded and thrown here, and there is not even a cremation. This is a very serious matter in the Dothraki tradition, because it means that Kotho's soul will have nowhere to go. Khal Drogo must reclaim his body for his brother, so Kotho's head together with his body, and then cremate it, so that Kotho's soul can reach the heaven, and become a warrior riding a group of flaming horses in the night sky. Oh no, the Dothraki warriors looked at each other, and they all felt a little scalp tingling. They had a bad feeling that something terrible was going to happen. The furious Khal Drogo might only be able to quench his anger by killing all the lambs. Let's go back and tell the Khal. The situation was urgent. Then, without wasting any more time, a Dothraki warrior grabbed the part of Kotho's head where his braids had been cut off with one hand, lifted the head of his bloodridder, and climbed onto his warhorse. Then he urged his mount to rush straight into Khal Drogo's tent. A moment later, blood of my blood, the atmosphere in Khal Drogo's golden roof tent was extremely depressing, and all the Khors who led their own caste also rushed to the Khal's tent after hearing the news. Drogo's other two bloodridders, the older Kohalro who had saved Drogo's life, and the huge, taciturn Hago, stood behind Drogo, with sadness and anger in their eyes. They were brothers in life and death, and had sworn a blood oath to become Drogo's bloodridders, but now one of them had been killed. Khal Drogo himself was also sitting on the throne at this moment, his fists clenched, his nails even slightly white, and his knuckles kept making light sounds. At this moment, he also knew who the enemy he was facing was. He had even forgotten it, but at this moment, he finally remembered the silver-haired boy he met in Pentas a year ago who made him feel a little threatened. And at this moment, he killed his bloodridder, and cut off his head to humiliate himself. Beetles will chew your eyes. Khal Drogo's voice suddenly sounded in the tent. He seemed to be talking to himself, then stood up, and drew his scimitar. Worms will crawl in your lungs. All the Dothraki couldn't help, but tremble in fear. Raindrops will hit your rotting skin, until you are only a pile of bones. Boom. Then Drogo smashed the table in front of him with a punch. Chapter 118 Regent. Beep. The horn of war was blown again. The boundless Dothraki gathered again. After a night's rest, their mental state was restored to the best again. Rumble. Then they rushed towards Goldohol with great momentum. Far to the east of the Velvet Mountains. Goldohol, the ruins of the ancient Rhoynar city, was erupting in a rare war in recent years. The protagonists of the war were the Rhoynar and Intels, who had lost the glory of their ancestors, and were gradually declining. They united to fight against the Dothraki who swept across the continent of Essos, trampled every inch of land with powerful lion hooves, and it was almost difficult to find an opponent. The furious Khal Drogo swore a poisonous oath to cut off Viserys' head and let his body rot and be crawling with maggots. At the same time, far away, in the city of Andalus, Viserys led the army on an expedition. Taking advantage of the rebellion that broke out in the Iron Islands across the Narrow Sea, King Robert focused all his attention on suppressing the rebellion. He dispatched a large army to continue to expand his territory in this unowned land, and gradually became a powerful force that could not be ignored on the continent of Essos. The city-state of Andalus, which unified the Andals and some Rhoynar, had a large number of villages and towns under its jurisdiction, and possessed a strong war capability. However, Viserys had only returned to Andalus a few times during this 6-month journey. The last time he returned to the castle was 3 months ago, when he conquered the Rhoynar on both sides of the upper Rhoynar River and returned. This time, Viserys ran to the Velvet Mountains in the south, and had not returned yet. Viserys left Andalus, but the affairs of the city-state still needed someone to handle. The old knight led the fleet to stay on Dragonstone Island, to prevent the victorious royal fleet from leading the army to cross the Narrow Sea to attack Andalus with a great victory, and naturally had no time to manage the trivial matters in the city-state. Therefore, all the affairs of Andalus are now handled by the eldest princess Rhaenys Targaryen, assisted by Maester Gunnar, who teaches her how to sit on the throne on behalf of Viserys to handle government affairs. In fact, according to common sense, Viserys' sister Daenerys Targaryen is older, and should be the eldest princess. However, although Viserys did not announce it to the public, he still told his prime minister to temporarily designate the position of heir to his sister. Therefore, the purpose of compensation was initially because Rhaenys was older, and even Rhaenys took more care of Daenerys than herself, playing the role of a mother. In order to compensate Rhaenys and balance the difference in age and generation between the two girls, Viserys gave Rhaenys the title of eldest princess. Now, although Daenerys is the designated heir, she is too young to distinguish right from wrong, and cannot sit on the throne to handle government affairs on behalf of Viserys. And the eldest princess Rhaenys Targaryen is naturally the more suitable one. Therefore, the girl with long brown hair put on the ruby crown left by Viserys, which was also a treasure left by her grandmother, Rhaela Targaryen. Then she adjusted her bright red skirt, closed her fair and tight calves, and sat on the high throne in the castle hall. Maester Gunnar, who was still wearing a simple grey robe and a Maester's chain, sat beside the eldest princess, and would provide her with some advice when necessary. Master Gunnar. Then Rhaenys looked at the Maester nervously, and the Maester nodded slightly, to provide some encouragement to the girl. Then he spoke loudly to the guards below. Please, the first one to come in. The sunlight on both sides penetrated the windows on the castle wall, and sprinkled into the hall. Soon, Footsteps were heard outside the hall, and a short man walked in, bowed with one hand on his chest. Your Highness, may the seven gods protect your uncle and all the children of Andalus, and allow them to return victorious. Renus sat on the throne wearing a crown, holding the armrest of the throne with her fingers, nodded slightly and corrected. It's my brother. Aha. However, the short man below was just about to cry and complain, but was interrupted by Renus, and then looked at the girl on the throne in a daze. The girl's mischief was naturally glared at by Mr. Gunda, and then she stuck out her tongue slightly and smiled embarrassedly. She just made a small joke, and Renus whispered to apologize to her teacher. Sorry, Master Gunda. Then Renus raised her delicate chin, looked down with a pair of beautiful eyes, and spoke in a crisp voice. Nothing, you just heard it wrong. Please continue next. Renus was in the main hall of the castle for the first time, to handle the affairs of Andalus on behalf of Viserys. Another princess in the castle, Princess Daenerys Targaryen, is a little quiet and shy. She has been hatching dragon eggs for half a year, since her brother Viserys left, and she has never thought of giving up. In the early morning, Rhaenys was already dressed, and sitting on the throne in the hall, while Daenerys was still sleeping soundly with her pale milky white dragon egg in her arms. The servant who was responsible for taking care of Daenerys wanted to wake up the princess, but the old maid was holding a lamp, and saw that the girl in the room was still sleeping soundly with the curtains drawn, and her dragon egg in her arms, so she felt a little sympathetic. The old maid did not disturb Daenerys, and continued to sleep. Then she closed the door, and walked out with the oil lamp. However, what she did not notice, was that when she turned around just now, a drop of burning kerosene fell out of the lamp in her hand, and fell on a handful of insect repellent grass placed at the corner of the door in Daenerys' room. Because Andalus is located near mountains and rivers, and not far from the sea, the air and climate here are a bit humid, and there are many mosquitoes in the castle. So Viserys bought some insect repellents a long time ago, and put them in the castle. There are especially many insect repellent in Daenerys' room. Because the little girl is very afraid of insects, she will feel uncomfortable if she finds one in the room. Even if the smell of insect repellent is a bit pungent, she can tolerate it. The old maid staggered out of Daenerys' room with an oil lamp, and her footsteps could be heard in the corridor. However, no one saw that a small flame was growing vigorously at this moment, gradually devouring the flammable insect repellent around. Then, it spread rapidly. Chapter 119 Judgment. The sparks had not been discovered yet. In the castle's main hall, the eldest princess of Andalus was still undergoing her first trial. Just now, she suddenly made a playful joke, which made the serious atmosphere in the hall suddenly not seem so serious. However, Mr. Gunda was helpless. Rhaenys was just such a character, and he could not control this lively girl, and the person who could scold her had not returned for 3 months. The man standing below did not seem to have gotten around this corner, and scratched his hair in confusion. Isn't His Majesty the King the eldest princess uncle? Why did the eldest princess call him brother? He did not figure out whether he really heard it wrong, or for some other reason, but at the moment he did not forget that he still had things to do. Then the man slightly brewed his emotions, and his emotions surged up in an instant. He sat down on the ground with a plop, and then began to cry and complain. It turned out that this man's wife had betrayed him, committed adultery with his neighbor, and even took away his savings. The man cried hysterically, snot and tears smeared on the ground of the castle. The surrounding guards even couldn't bear to watch, and Rhaenys, who was sitting on the highest throne in the hall, also got goosebumps all over her body. Master Gunda, how should adultery be punished? Then the girl turned her head and looked at Mr. Gunda for help. Before this, it was actually the Mr. who had always been handling government affairs in the city-state on behalf of Viserys. Today was Rhaenys' first day on the job, but she never thought it would be such a trivial matter. The Mr. also felt a little scalp tingling. He just wanted to find a small dispute for Rhaenys to practice, but he didn't expect it to be such a thing. Then the Mr. coughed lightly and whispered to Rhaenys that everything should start with small things first, and don't be too ambitious. Then he began to explain to Rhaenys what adultery was. Adultery is not tolerated by the 7 gods. The wife and sister of Aegon the Conqueror, the little Queen Rhaenys. Mr. Gunda paused for a moment, then explained. Your Highness, this respected queen has the same name as you. Venus nodded to show that she understood. In fact, she had long known that she had the same name as the Little Queen. The Little Queen Venus once sat on the Iron Throne to rule the country in place of her husband and establish the 6-strike law, which stipulates that women who commit adultery are only allowed to be whipped 6 times at most, and the stick used cannot be thicker than a thumb. Venus later persuaded her husband Gian to legislate against forcibly seizing women and crack down on the salt concubine system in the Iron Islands. Mr. Gunther was knowledgeable and explained very comprehensively. Women who committed adultery would be whipped 6 times, and the cuckolded man also retained the right to challenge the other party to a duel and would not be punished, even if he killed the other party. This was a default of self-inflicted trouble. In the religious field, the 7 gods will never tolerate the crime of adultery, and the adulterer may be sentenced to parade in public. However, it depends on how the local nobles can flexibly control the judicial power of the cases in the territory. However, Your Highness, remember not to listen to only one side of the story. After explaining clearly, Mr. Gunther told Venus that all things should not be based on the man's one-sided story. Then Mr. Gunther asked the man's wife and the other party who committed adultery to come to the hall together. And in the following multi-party narration, the whole thing really took a series of subtle turns. It turned out that this man had a habit of alcoholism on weekdays and often beat and scolded his wife at home, so his wife resented the man. In the end, he secretly had an affair with his neighbor, and the neighbor even took away a lot of the man's money, but his wife didn't know about it. Venus, who was sitting on the throne, heard that this man had a habit of beating and scolding his wife on weekdays, and even saw the scars on his wife in court, and frowned immediately. Master Gunther, I remember that intentional injury should be sentenced to limb mutilation. Venus asked that a finger on the hand of the man who beat his wife should be chopped off as punishment. However, Venus's verdict was stopped by Mr. Gunther. Stop, Your Highness. Please wait a moment. The Maester smiled bitterly and hurriedly admonished the somewhat angry girl. In fact, there is a better way to judge this matter. Then, Mr. Gunther sat on his side seat and presided over the trial independently. Because the city-state was first built, there was no law to rely on, so Andalus just copied some simple laws commonly used in the noble territories on the continent of Westeros. In the end, the Maester spoke up to conclude the case. In the name of the 7 gods, he suggested that Venus sentence the plaintiff and his wife to divorce. The man was not charged with intentional injury, and the wife was not charged with adultery. The two were let go. The neighbor who stole the man's savings and committed adultery with the other's wife was sentenced to lose a hand as punishment. Although Venus didn't understand why her teacher made such a judgment, she still followed his advice and announced the sentence. Then Mr. Gunther waved his hand and asked the guards on both sides to drive away the people present, especially the neighbor who was asked to chop off one hand during the trial. The crying sound was too loud and made him a little upset. When everything in the hall was quiet, Mr. Gunther turned his head and looked at the brown-haired girl wearing a crown. Your Highness, do you understand? Understand? What? Venus sat on the throne and watched Master Gunther preside over the entire trial. Except for the final judgment, she represented Viserys and the 7 gods, and then the whole process had nothing to do with her. The girl blinked her eyes and was a little confused. She didn't know what the Maester made her understand. She actually had some residual anger just now, but now she calmed down and thought about it. Both sides seemed to be wrong. How should the trial be fair? Are you thinking about justice, Your Highness? The grey-robed Maester looked into the girl's eyes and then spoke abruptly. Venus was reminded by the bachelor's voice, and she came back to her senses slightly, then looked at Master Gunther and nodded. Master Gunther, shouldn't the law be enforced impartially? Indeed, the law should be enforced impartially. There is nothing wrong with that. The bachelor nodded, agreeing with Venus's point of view. But Your Highness, as a noble, you have the judicial power over cases within the territory. You can freely adjust within the framework and strive to achieve a good outcome. Because the purpose of the law is not to punish but to persuade. Chapter 124. Not a punishment. The girl's white fingers pinched slightly under her sleeves, and she felt as if she understood something. Yes, Your Highness. If the law is strictly enforced, the husband who committed the crime of intentional injury will be mutilated, and the wife who committed adultery will be whipped in public, or even stripped naked, and paraded through the streets. As for the neighbor, he himself committed the crime of theft, so he will naturally lose one of his hands. In this way, all three people have been strictly punished, and now only one person has received the due punishment, and the other two have been warned. The bachelor crossed his fingers on the table, and explained patiently to the brown-haired girl wearing a crown. Thump thump thump. However, at this moment, there was a hurried sound of footsteps at the back of the hall, and a guard hurried over. Your Highness. Bachelor. Something bad is happening. At this time, Renus and Bachelor Gunther, who were sitting in the hall, also smelled a burnt smell in the air. Then they looked at each other, and stood up suddenly. Because the castle was built in a hurry in the early stage, a lot of wood was used in the construction of Andalus Castle. There are large areas of wooden houses in the whole city of Andalus, and it was even called the Wooden City for a time. A few years ago, an unprecedented fire occurred, causing serious losses. Since then, Viserys has ordered the gradual abolition of wooden buildings in the city, and replaced them with stones. However, this process is not that simple. It may take several years or even more than 10 years or decades to build a magnificent castle. Although Viserys knows the shortcomings of wooden houses, it is impossible to replace them quickly with an order. Therefore, there are still a lot of wooden materials in the buildings in Andalus Castle today, including the main building where Viserys and the two girls live. Early in the morning, a sudden fire caught people off guard. No one expected that a fire would suddenly start in this humid spring season. However, when Renus and the bachelor entered the main building, the fire had almost engulfed the entire royal bedroom. Thick smoke continued to rise to the sky, red flames gushed out of the windows, and screams continued to be heard. It was obvious that many people in the castle were trapped in the fire. Hurry, hurry, run. The guards around all ran under the command, and were constantly pouring water to put out the fire, but no one dared to rush in to save people. Because it was obvious that the fire was now out of control, the raging fire and smoke soared into the sky, and the air was filled with a pungent smell. At this time, Renus and the Maester also rushed to the scene. The girl with long brown hair saw the blazing fire and her face turned pale in an instant. Then she saw Knight Bessie was also at the scene, and hurriedly ran over and asked anxiously, "Lord Bessie, is Daenerys out?" However, the young Andal Knight turned his head, his eyes were a little red at this moment, and he was asking the guards next to him to pour water on a blanket. At this moment, Bessie had taken off her coat, revealing her strong muscles. On his shoulders was a 7-pointed star symbolizing the faith of the 7 gods, as if he wanted to rush into the fire to save people. Because his widowed mother was also in the castle, and did not come out. She was the old maid who was responsible for taking care of Daenerys. "Please rest assured, princess. I will save Her Highness." Bessie looked at Rhaenys's beautiful cheek, forced herself to suppress her worries about her mother, raised her hand to wipe away her tears, and then knelt on one knee and swore solemnly, "Please, please be careful." Then the loyal young Andal Knight put on the heavy bedding that was completely soaked with water and plunged into the main castle without hesitation despite the smoke of the fire. Rhaenys and others continued to wait anxiously outside the castle. Boom. However, not too long after, a loud noise came from the sea of fire. It seemed that the fire burned the beams and then collapsed, burying everything. Meow. At this time, a black cat like a small coal ball rushed out from the sea of fire, with flames still burning on its tail, and a lot of its hair was burnt. Only a pair of eyes were still bright. Wow. Then the guard poured a basin of water on the little black cat from head to tail, extinguishing the flames on its body, and then it ran towards Rhaenys. Balerion. Rhaenys saw the little black cat escape from the sea of fire, and the anxiety on her face was relieved a little, and she even shed tears of joy. This was a little comfort for the anxious girl. She hoped that this was a good sign, and Knight Bessie could save Daenerys from the sea of fire. Otherwise she didn't know how to face Viserys. Then the girl with long brown hair squatted down and held Balerion in her arms. In the sea of fire, a little girl with silver curly hair was quietly holding her dragon egg and seemed to be sleeping sweetly. The flames were like red elves, circling and dancing beside her, singing for her. Then, the nightgown on the girl was ignited, and the flames walked on her smooth and white skin. The beautiful silver gold hair that looked like molten silver was also teased by the naughty elves. Finally, the flames completely enveloped Daenerys, and the girl's body became completely naked, curled up without a single piece of clothing. Daenerys was still in her sleep, her brows slightly frowned, as if she felt some discomfort, or was disturbed by the noisy sounds around her, and then continued to curl up her body, hugging her Viserion tightly. The girl's white and tender skin was like a piece of solidified fat, clinging to the pale milky white dragon egg. At this time, the dragon egg also made a subtle sound. Caca. At the same time, the ceiling supporting the castle finally couldn't withstand the burning of the fire, and collapsed in an instant, making a huge noise. Boom. Instantly awakened Daenerys, who was sleeping. What happened? The girl opened her eyes, and then she was horrified to find that she was completely in a sea of fire at this moment. There was even some deja vu. Am I dreaming? Daenerys looked around in confusion, but everything she saw was completely covered in flames. In fact, she had a similar dream a few months ago. She dreamed of a white dragon singing for her, then opening its bloody mouth, spitting out raging blue flames, and burning down her house. This was exactly what she saw. Chapter 121 Evaluation. A raging fire was burning in the city of Vandalis. In the distance, at the confluence of the Upper Rhine River and the Little Rhine River, a fierce battle was taking place. The two sides, with a total of more than 20,000 people, gathered in this ancient city-state full of ruins. The shouts of killing shook the sky, the horn sounded desolate, the sound of horses' hooves hitting the ground was like thunder, and the air was full of disgusting smells. The Andalus army used various means to resist the attack of the Dothraki, and the Dothraki seemed to have learned from their mistakes, and were no longer so reckless. However, even so, the Dothraki still paid a heavy price to successfully reach the front of the Andalus army. The densely packed small pits did not seem to have any effect at first, but when the Dothraki army rushed to the front, their effect was clearly exerted. The horses were galloping at high speed and couldn't stop when they came close. In a panic, the horse's hooves accidentally stepped into a horse pit that was not too deep and only the size of a horse's leg. Boom, smoke, and dust scattered in an instant, and half of the body fell down. Crack, the horse's leg, that was deeply sunk, was also directly broken by its own powerful impact, and it let out a painful neigh. The huge and heavy body of the warhorse collapsed on the ground, splashing dust. The horse's leg was broken, and the Dothraki warrior riding on the horse's back naturally had no good end. He was thrown off the horse and hit the ground heavily. Plop, the body flew several meters or even more than 10 meters away, rolling far away on the flat ground. Just like the two messengers who fell so suddenly last night, they still didn't react for a long time, and now the warhorse was charging much faster than last night, and the fall was even more miserable. Some suffered from dizziness, and some suffered from fractures, broken legs and arms, and some even died on the spot. However, even those who were only slightly injured did not have time to celebrate. The tribesmen who came from behind like a tide could not stop their cars at all, and they never even thought about stopping. They just stepped on the horses and tribesmen who were tripped by the pits. Boom boom boom, the sound of horses' hooves roared chaotically, hitting the ground, and mixed in the dense crowd was a shrill scream, and then it stopped abruptly. Roar, roar, roar. The Dothraki let out a piercing howl, even crazier than yesterday, as if they had taken hormones, with their upper bodies naked, revealing various painted totems, waving their erax. Fearless, they once again charged towards Andalus' line. And on the high ground, a Baron put on his armor, with the emblem of the Martel family's golden spear on his chest. He held a spear in one hand and the reins in the other. He turned his head and looked at Viserys beside him. Viserys. The horse trapping tactic failed. The horse trapping tactic has a huge restriction on cavalry, and ordinary trenches have no effect on cavalry like the Dothraki. After all, these light cavalry have a lightweight, and can move like the wind, and the Dothraki riding skills are also very good, and they can jump over the trenches directly. Unless Viserys can dig the trench as wide as a moat, but in that case the Dothraki can also choose to bypass it. The dense small horse trapping holes are not only small in size to hide themselves, but also the war horses will fall into them if they walk on them accidentally, breaking their legs and losing their combat effectiveness. However, the horse trapping tactic does not always work. As long as the shield-bearing infantry is at the front, carrying some earth bags on their shoulders, and slowing down the advance, the pits can be filled step by step with the earth bags carried by the soldiers. However, the Dothraki tribe was an army composed entirely of light cavalry, and they chose a more brutal and useful method. That is to fill all the horse traps with flesh and blood, until the subsequent war horses can smoothly pass through the horse traps. These things will be useless. And Viserys has naturally put on his armor at this moment, looking at the battlefield not far away with a sharp gaze. He heard Oberyn's voice, turned his head slightly to look at him, then retracted his gaze, and continued to speak. I didn't expect to defeat Khal Drogo with just a horse trap. The Dothraki can plunder the four directions, and dominate the continent of Essos. You don't think they are so easy to deal with, do you? The Dothraki can make the free trade cities other than Bravos submissive, naturally, not only because of the protection of caravans and trade routes. This nation may be born for fighting. Their people have been competing since the moment they were born. Except for the translator, who grew up in the Golden Group, almost none of those who can survive to grow up are not ruthless. Just like the blood-ridder Kotho who was beheaded by Viserys, he was in the military camp of Andorras, and even had a sword on his neck by the guards, but he was still thinking about how to kidnap Viserys. You think highly of this Drogo? Oberyn turned his head, and looked at Viserys, while sitting on his warhorse, and he seemed to have grasped a point. From what I heard, this Khal Drogo seems to be just a horse king who is not worthy of any reputation in the Great Grass Sea. Drogo's cows are not very large now. This is the size after he organized the tribesmen left by his father, and annexed two smaller cows. But in the Dothraki Sea, where the big fish eat the small fish, he is still the one who may be eaten. This time, Drogo led his troops to plunder westward, because a powerful cows passed by him, which frightened Drogo and hurriedly gave way with his tail between his legs, and was forced to be driven to the territory of the Western Free Trade City-State. Even the tribe's warhorses had no rich and fertile pastures to graze, and could only nibble on some roadside weeds that had no nutritional value. Even his own mount had lost some weight, which made Drogo very distressed. Viserys seemed to be stumped by Oberyn's question. He found that this Prince of Dawn was worthy of being a top student who had won 6 links of the Meester chain. He could always easily find the key points of some problems, and do things that others could not do. Then, Viserys pulled the reins, his eyes scanning the battlefield in front of him without turning his head, and spoke. Yes, I think if Drogo grows up, he may become the most powerful horse king on the Great Grass Sea. That's why I'm going to try my best to kill him this time. Chapter 122, Attack from both sides. Neither Viserys nor Oberyn participated in the battle personally. Around them were 100 of the most elite knights in the entire Andalus army, all of whom were equipped with full body plate armor, and even the horses were the best and strongest ones, covered with chainmail. Now these knights were sitting on the ground, not riding on their horses. Their followers were grooming the horse's hair, and the horse armor was also placed on the ground, in order to save the horse's physical strength to the greatest extent. The idea of forming a heavy cavalry unit came from when Viserys was invited to attend the Pentos banquet a year ago. At that time, the Little King selected 100 elite knights to follow him into the city of Pentos. These 100 people are the team of the 100 heavy cavalry now. The cost Viserys spent to build them was very huge. Just the full body plate armor and horse armor on them cost nearly 20 gold dragons per person. This huge expenditure made Viserys, who had always been careful with his budget, a little painful, but he still thought that the money was worth spending, and looked forward to their performance. Instead of arming more ordinary soldiers, it is better to build such an elite force, which may play an unexpected role in certain battlefields with specific conditions. Now these heavy cavalry gathered around Viserys, waiting for the Little King to give orders and ready to participate in the battle at any time. These heavy cavalry must seize the right opportunity to deal with the Dothraki, otherwise their heavy armor and slow movement speed will easily be lost. On the other side, when Oberyn was surprised at Viserys' amazing high evaluation of Khal Drogo, the battle situation in the distance changed again. It is also a weapon against cavalry. Viserys ordered the soldiers to cut down several trees overnight, to make some chevorksty fries, and place them on the road leading to Goldoho. If the horse trap is the first line of defense, then these chevauxty fries that fill the narrow road are the second line of defense. However, the Dothraki in the front row let out an incomprehensible excited howl, and then pulled out the lock sleeve from somewhere, and waved it directly, accurately putting it on the chevauxty fries in the middle of the road. Rumble. Then, with the help of the power of the warhorse, several chevauxty fries were dragged aside, clearing the central road, and the Dothraki rushed over directly. Who is responsible for setting up the chevauxty fries here? Viserys frowned slightly when he saw this scene, and was a little angry. Didn't I say that the chevauxty fries should be buried underground? The chevauxty fries was fixed in the ground, and it was not so easy for the Dothraki to break the chevauxty fries with a lasso. The herald turned pale when he saw the little king getting angry, and his mouth moved, but he still dared not say anything. However, this kind of accountability will be solved after the war. Now on the ever-changing battlefield, Viserys naturally has no time to investigate whose work has not been done well. Unless he can make meritorious contributions on the battlefield, such mistakes that affect the war situation will cause an unknown number of casualties among Andalus soldiers, and he will inevitably be judged and sent to the gallows. The horse traps and the chevauxty fries array were broken by the Dothraki one after another, and the Andalus army's defense line was once again in a precarious situation. This is exactly the terrifying part of the Dothraki. An army that is fearless and unafraid of death will inevitably be invincible on the battlefield. On the first day of the encounter, the Dothraki were in high spirits, and the morale of the Andalus army was also very firm. Andalus also had a geographical advantage, relying on the abandoned city to finally resist the enemy's attack tenaciously. The Dothraki left a pile of corpses and retreated. However, on the second day, the Andalus army experienced yesterday's fierce battle, suffered heavy casualties, and its morale had obviously dropped a lot, and the fear was rising. But the Dothraki experienced yesterday's heavy casualties, and today's morale was not only not traumatized, but became even higher, and even more fearless and unafraid of death. Such a strong contrast of one side losing the other side was magnified on the battlefield, causing the defense line of the Andalus army to become more and more precarious, and even began to retreat step by step without being able to withstand the pressure. Perhaps on the battlefield, individuals could not sense it, but were just carried away by the army. Each individual was only a tiny part of this vast ocean, and no matter how brave they were, they could not change the situation. However, Viserys, standing on the high ground, saw it clearly. As the leader of the tribe, Cal may charge in the front, but he is definitely not the first wave. I saw old people and women. Viserys was not a Dothraki, and he didn't know who would take charge of the Dothraki after the Horse King personally joined the battle, or even if he didn't need to command. And he seemed to see the figures of older Dothraki and women on the chaotic battlefield, and they seemed to be carried away in the battle. It seems that Drogo is really angry, and his anger has devoured his reason. Then the little king turned his head and asked the guards around him, "Have you prepared the kerosene and hay and firewood?" Viserys would naturally bring some baggage with him, and kerosene was obviously an important strategic material, but he didn't bring much, and with a large amount of accelerants, it might be enough. Viserys needed these things to defeat Khal Drogo in one fell swoop. War horses are afraid of fire, and so are people. People can control their fear, but war horses can't. However, the Dothraki walk on four legs, and it is not the people who decide where to run, but the frightened war horses. Your Majesty, it's ready. The front line was struggling to withstand the pressure, and the soldiers in the rear had already chiseled barrels of kerosene with daggers and short swords. They threw them on the road in front of the battle, and were trampled into pieces by the chaotic horses' hooves, and the kerosene flowed all over the ground. Very good. Viserys nodded slightly, looking at the battle line that was retreating not far away, and was just about to give orders. But at this moment, in the chaos, the sound of horse hooves sounded from afar again. Your Majesty, a herald reminded him, and Viserys' eyes narrowed, and then he saw that a large number of Dothraki had left the team. They were about to roar from the side of the Andalus army. As expected, Viserys gripped the reins and took a deep breath, but he did not panic. It turned out that the Dothraki used a simple tactic this time. They knew that it was not easy to chew a hard bone, so they wanted to attack from both sides and swallow all the Andalus people in one bite. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 123, The Greatest Horseman. Aberin, I'll leave that to you. Viserys surveyed the battlefield, breathing in the restless smell in the air, and tried to calm himself down completely. However, it was not easy to do this. No one could remain completely calm on a chaotic battlefield, and his emotions would inevitably be affected by the turmoil of the war. And Aberin also knew that this was the critical period of this war. The Andalus army now had nearly half of the Roina. If it were only the 4,000 Andal warriors led by Viserys at the beginning, perhaps this battle would not have fallen into a passive situation. Of course, this is not to say that the Roina are not as brave as the Andals. Both nations have risen to famous countries in history. It is because the Roina are new to the Andalus system, and many of them are even recruits. The fear spread by their existence may even affect Viserys' most elite Andal warriors. It is extremely tough for such an army to withstand the first wave of attacks. Understood. Then Aberin nodded, led a rotation of reserve forces to leave, and blocked another entrance to the ruined city. Viserys and Aberin were not surprised by the Dothraki's flexibility, because Aberin reminded Viserys last night to be careful of the Dothraki's tactical changes, and the other side was not completely brainless. However, war is ever changing, and it cannot escape the situation of one side attacking, and the other defending, or one side attacking, and the other defending. There is always a more aggressive side. Now the Andalus army cannot go out of the city to fight in the field due to its geographical advantage. It is very likely that the morale will be greatly affected by the enemy from both sides. Unless they are elite soldiers who have fought many battles, they will not be able to hold their ground, and may even be wiped out here. Therefore, Aberin was very supportive of Viserys' action of chopping off the head of the blood-ridder Cotho with a sword, and sending it back to anger Khal Drogo. Otherwise, the Dothraki surrounded Gol Doha, besieging him without attacking. The longer the delay, the more disadvantageous it would be for the Andalus army. The few supplies they carried would be overwhelmed by fear. Now, Cotho's head was sent back, and many Dothraki saw it and spread it. Drogo must avenge his blood of my blood, otherwise he would lose the hearts of the people in the Khals. A Khal who does not have the courage to avenge his brothers in life and death is not qualified to lead the entire Khals. Drogo, who has lost his prestige, will have more troubles. Viserys' actions actually left Drogo with no way out. This is what Aberin was most puzzled about. Therefore, he repeatedly asked Viserys whether there was any grudge between him and Khal Drogo. How big was the grudge? He actually felt that it was no big deal to capture 3,000 slaves and give them 10,000 gold dragons. 10,000 gold dragons were not something that Andalus could not afford, and 3,000 slaves were nothing. All free trade cities did the same. The current situation seems to be that Drogo will not let Viserys go, but in fact, Viserys does not seem to intend to let Drogo go either. The two people are trying their best to kill each other. Drogo is because of Viserys' unjust act of killing the messenger, and perhaps he also feels that he is facing a madman. Isn't it normal to send someone to ask for some money? All Dothraki do this. However, the madman on the other side killed his blood guards with a knife without caring, which made Drogo unable to get off the tiger and had to kill him. On the chaotic battlefield, Drogo Khal rode his majestic black warhorse, with long hair hanging down, like a lion on the grassland, and its height was obviously much taller than the warhorse beside it. Drogo Khal led his only two remaining blood guards, Hago and Koholro, and appeared quietly at the forefront of the battlefield. The three of them sat upright on their warhorses. Drogo's long braids fell behind his back. As he urged his horse forward, a bell jingled. The heavy bronze belt wrapped around his abdomen, which was the only armor on his body, revealed his strong chest muscles. Khal Drogo led two blood guards to the front of the battlefield, then reined in his warhorses, and then turned over. Because the front was already filled with the bodies of warhorses and soldiers from both sides, as well as some broken Chevorksty fries, it was obviously not convenient to urge the horses forward. At this moment, on the chaotic battlefield, several Andalus soldiers who came out from nowhere and stood in front of him with their swords raised high showed obvious fear in the face of Drogo. They didn't know the man in front of them, but the strong body of the Dothraki warrior in front of them, as well as the dark and deep eyes, still made them feel fear involuntarily. This guy. Several Andalus soldiers looked at each other, their throats rolled slightly, their feet were constantly retreating, and then they seemed to have finally mustered up the courage and roared, "Kill." Then he rushed over with his long sword raised high, wanting to kill Drogo here. The two blood ridders standing behind Drogo, the silent Hago and the older Kohala with broken teeth, drew their scimitars from their waists and wanted to block Drogo. However, they were stopped by Drogo. Drogo made a low sound, tilted his head slightly, and ordered the two men to retreat in Dothraki. He wanted to face these 6 enemies alone. Then his eyes were deep and calm as he looked at the 6 Andalus soldiers in front of him. Then he drew his Arak scimitar from his waist and waved it slightly in his hand. Then the first Andalus soldier who rushed up raised his long sword high and chopped it down, trying to cut Drogo in half with a cross-shoulder sword. Wow. The bell on the braid made a sound, and Drogo dodged it easily. Drogo's long beard trembled, and the face of the young Andalus soldier was reflected in his dark eyes. Unlike Viserys' purple eyes, Drogo's reactions and movements seemed to have been integrated with him, like flowing clouds and water. This was the experience accumulated by a warrior who had experienced hundreds of battles, as well as Drogo's innate terrifying talent. His father, Cal Bulbo, once commented on his son as the greatest horseman in the world. This was not only a high hope, but also the truth. Kill. Then, the remaining Andalus soldiers saw this scene, and mustered up their courage to rush up and besiege Drogo together. Chapter 124 An Ominous Premonition. The soldiers of Andalus believed that no matter how powerful a warrior was, it was impossible to defeat a larger force with a smaller one, not to mention that they were not lambs to be slaughtered. However, they still overestimated the gap between themselves and the greatest horseman in the world. The distance between them was actually not much different from that between a man and a sheep. Drogo's eyes were calm and unperturbed. The heavy scimitar in his hand, with a strong sound of wind, directly chopped off the cartilage on the throat of an Andalus soldier and chopped off his head. The head rolled down, and blood splattered instantly. At the same moment, in the chaotic battle, Drogo fought 1 against 5. Clang, the sound of metal friction. An Andalus soldier wanted to stab Drogo to death with his long sword, but the opponent killed his companion with a knife and dodged. The long sword passed by Khal Drogo's bronze belt, and clear sparks burst out. The powerful Dothraki warrior breathed heavily like thunder. His dark eyes were completely immersed in the battle, and he was surrounded by the remaining 5 Andalus soldiers. Swords flashed and shadowed. Then he swung his long braid and dodged the sword of the soldier next to him again. Swish. However, his long braid did not completely dodge it and was accidentally cut off by the sword of the Andalus soldier and fell to the ground with a snap. Cal, the silent Hago, saw this scene and tightened the scimitar in his hand. It was difficult for any warrior to fight against many because he only had a pair of eyes, and the enemies were not unarmed peasants. They were also experienced warriors. In his opinion, Kaz's move was a bit overconfident and risky. Drogo and Koholro, who had saved Drogo's life when he was a child, also wanted to draw his sword to help. But the 2 blood guards who wanted to draw their swords to help were stopped by Drogo, who raised his hand and said in Dothraki. The terrifying Dothraki warrior took a few steps back and escaped from the encirclement of the Andalus soldiers. Then his eyes fell on the section of his braid that was cut off and fell to the ground, and his dark and deep eyes condensed slightly. The Dothraki people are actually very superstitious. A broken braid means defeat. He thinks this may be a bad omen. Drogo's breathing is a little heavy. However, kill him. Just now, the sword almost cut off the opponent's head, but unfortunately only cut off a section of the opponent's braid. Then, seeing this strong Dothraki warrior retreat, the remaining 5 Andalus soldiers obviously boosted their morale. They thought that the opponent was afraid, and then they wanted to take advantage of the victory to kill the 3 Dothraki in front of them. The Andalus soldiers rushed over again, trying to kill Drogo, and Drogo finally came to his senses, retracted his gaze from the braid on the ground, raised his head, and looked at several Andalus soldiers, and anger and determination gradually burned in his dark and deep eyes. Like an enraged lion, he let out a deep roar. Then the terrifying Dothraki warrior swung his blood-stained scimitar. The heavy scimitar swung again with the sound of the wind, dodging the attack of a soldier. Puff. Then he chopped another soldier's waist with a knife, directly throwing the soldier's body in the air, cutting it in half. Clang clang. Then the strong figure turned flexibly, and the scimitar in his hand, cut off a spear, killing the opponent like cutting melons and vegetables. Bang. Then the strong arm clamped a long sword again, and the muscles of the biceps and forearms clamped the long sword, making it impossible for the opponent to stab in, or pull it out. Then he turned around, and chopped off the head of another soldier with a knife. The soldier whose sword was clamped by his arm was full of horror, watching his companions being hacked to death, and he couldn't even pull out his sword. The inner defense line had already collapsed. It turned out that the opponent was not afraid just now, but had not yet wanted to kill him. Then the soldier was about to let go of the hilt and turn around to flee, but it was too late. Drogo threw away the arak in his hand, and the scimitar fell to the ground with a heavy sound. Then he grabbed the soldier's wrist, making it impossible for him to escape. His eyes were burning with anger, and he locked the soldier at close range. The terrifying bloodshot eyes made the other party's heart and liver break. His legs couldn't help but tremble. His mind was blank, and he only knew to open his mouth to beg for mercy, but he couldn't even make a sound, because he didn't know how to beg for mercy in Dothraki. However, Drogo didn't give him a chance to beg for mercy. He forced himself to suppress the fear of the ominous omen in his heart, and strengthened his determination to avenge Kotho. Then, in the other party's terrified eyes, he directly crushed the Andalus soldier's wrist, and cut his throat with his own sword. Puff. Blood sprayed on Drogo's strong chest. Then he loosened his hands, and the body fell to the ground weakly. In an instant, Drogo killed 5 of the 6 Andalus soldiers. The last soldier holding a shield felt his heart stop beating when he saw this horrifying scene. He trembled with his shield in his hand, and turned around to run away. However, Drogo kicked him to the ground, then picked up his arak, and chopped off his head. This smooth killing of 6 Andalus soldiers instantly boosted the morale of the Dothraki. Ha ha ho. Suddenly, a deafening cheer broke out among the Dothraki. All the Andalus soldiers also noticed this, and they looked at Khal Drogo with a little more fear, swallowed their saliva, and even took a few steps back involuntarily when they were swept by the others' eyes. Use arrows. Hurry up and shoot him to death with arrows. Then they shouted loudly, hoping that the archers would shoot the terrifying Dothraki warrior to death with arrows, and they must not let the other side lead the Dothraki to rush to the front. This is the role of the Khal as the most courageous warrior in the entire Khal. Although personal force does not play a big role in the war, it will inspire people. The Dothraki admire the strong. They are willing to submit to the powerful Khal, and are driven by the other side, to fight and plunder everywhere, and even die. After Drogo did all this, he was quickly protected by the Dothraki who rushed forward. Looking at the Andalus line in the distance, his eyes were cold and serious. Of course, he would not charge into the battle personally, because even if he had 9 lives, it would not be enough. However, at this moment, Drogo, who had withdrawn from the battle, sniffed slightly, and he suddenly smelled a strange smell. Drogo was very familiar with the smell on the battlefield, but this smell was different from the stench of blood, but it was a bit pungent. What is this? Then Drogo lowered his head and looked down. Chapter 125, Arson. Drogo's expression was still calm the previous second, but his expression suddenly changed the next second. Because the Dothraki had no fixed residence and wandered around, they dug a pit to lie in, and used straw mats as ceilings, so ordinary Dothraki did not have many opportunities to come into contact with kerosene. They rested at night, and woke up at dawn. As a Khal, Drogo had his own golden tent, and his living expenses were naturally different from those of ordinary Dothraki. He would come into contact with kerosene on weekdays. He finally smelled what the pungent smell in the air was, and then lowered his head, and his dark and deep eyes suddenly tightened. He saw this black and slightly sticky substance all over the ground under his feet. When he raised his feet, he found that his feet and horsehair leggings were stained with this substance without knowing when. At the same time, there were some bundles of weeds and firewood on the ground. The Dothraki thought that the Andalus army had run out of tricks and pulled out all the baggage carts of their army to the front, so they naturally trampled these haystacks and firewood without mercy. Now these weeds and firewood are stuck together with a black and sticky substance on the ground. The horses' hooves were chaotic and noisy, and there were corpses everywhere under their feet. Perhaps the Dothraki had noticed this, but they didn't take it seriously. Drogo was surrounded and retreated to the back of the formation, but his face suddenly tensed up. He had already sensed Viserys' conspiracy. The kerosene and combustibles on the ground would have disastrous consequences if they were ignited. The terrifying Dothraki warrior couldn't help but tremble slightly. Drogo, who had slaughtered, looted, and raped without blinking an eye, suddenly felt a feeling of fear gradually spreading in his heart. Crash. Then he turned over and sat on the warhorse. The bronze belt made a sound, and Drogo tore off the horsehair leggings stained with fire oil, and then shouted loudly, "Os." This is the Dothraki language for stop, and it also includes the meaning of retreat. However, the Dothraki language does not have a specific word for retreat, just as there is no trade in the Dothraki language, only gift and return. Khal Drogo suddenly ordered a retreat, and the two blood guards following him did not understand what was going on. But the Khal's order was unquestionable, and then the two blood guards conveyed the Khal's order to the outside. Oh hoes. The Khal's order to retreat suddenly came from the chaotic battlefield, and at the same time, the Khal's blood guards also asked to blow the horn for the entire army to retreat. However, it was too late at this moment. Set fire. Viserys sat upright on the warhorse and gave the order to ignite the fire that had been prepared long ago. Viserys had been waiting for Drogo. As long as Drogo didn't show up, Viserys would hold down the order in his hand and not issue it. Because all Viserys' goals were to kill him, and even to fight this battle, to take the head of this mortal enemy, even if many soldiers were sacrificed. And now, Drogo finally showed up in front of the battle. Since the target had been caught, the Little King finally stopped suppressing, and ignited the fire. Countless arrows infected with kerosene were ignited, and then shot at the back of the Dothraki. When the Andalus army dropped the kerosene, they deliberately separated a blank area to divide the Dothraki army, and at the same time, to avoid the fire in the narrow terrain of this ruined city. Although it is inevitable that it will be brought to a point, it is insignificant compared to the victory or defeat of the war. The wind direction is just right today. The white horse mane spread in the wind, as gorgeous as snowflakes. Viserys sat on the warhorse, with a calm face, but it was hard to say that there was no fluctuation in his heart. The 5 fingers covered with steel reflected the dazzling light in the morning sun. Click, then they clenched tightly together. This was the first time that the Little King commanded such a large-scale war in the name of Viserys Targaryen III. Unlike the previous naval battle of Storm's End, this time he commanded independently, and Oberyn, the Prince of Dawn, only played an auxiliary role. This was also the result of his countless small battles in the past few years, including reading the family histories of various nobles, summarizing and learning from history, and finally blooming and bearing fruit. The Battle of the Blackwater and the War of Conquest was a big fire that buried the nearly 55,000 troops of King Loren Lannister of Casterly Rock and King Mon IX of the Reach in the Golden Tree. He didn't dare to say how much he knew about the art of war or war. There were many people in the world who were more powerful than him, but Viserys never underestimated his enemies. From the beginning of dealing with Drogo, he took out a risk-taking attitude and spent all night and day to figure out how to kill the opponent. But Drogo obviously didn't think highly of him on the first day of the battle. Even the next day, he felt that this was a flock of sheep that would collapse at the first touch, and they just held on for a little longer. Prepare your armor. Then, Viserys turned around and asked the heavy cavalry behind him to start putting on their armor. Now the time to reap the fruits of victory has finally arrived, and the heavy cavalry that the Little King spent more than 2,000 gold dragons to build will also be used for the first time. This heavy cavalry includes 108 knights, 99 squires, 19 mounted archers, a trumpeter and a dedicated farrier. All the most elite knights of Andalus heard Viserys' order. Then, with the help of the squires, They quickly put on their armor, and the strong war horses beside them, which were picked from 100, also began to cover themselves with heavy horse armor. It's finally our turn. It's time to let these eggs that break at the first touch taste the taste of stone. The captain of the heavy cavalry, Saravan of the Roina, shouldered a double-edged battle axe, and the knights were all ready to fight. They had not had the opportunity to participate in the fierce battles of the past 2 days, but now they could finally participate in the battles, which taught these Dothraki some unforgettable and profound lessons. And among the Dothraki, this fire came a little unexpectedly. Shoot! With the order coming from behind the Andalus line, countless Andalus archers behind the line, including those in the ruins of the cities on both sides, had already been ready. Crash. Andalus archers came out from all directions. They dipped the arrows in kerosene, then ignited them in the fire, and then shot them out before the flames burned through the arrow shafts. Bang bang bang. The bowstrings burst out with sounds, and a rain of arrows burning with flames flew into the sky. Then they fell quickly, and rushed straight to the Jidoho road behind them, which was covered with kerosene. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.